everyone, Novels Wonderland here. Thank you all for the love and support you've shown me and the channel.
Plundering multiversal technology, starting from Marvel, Chapter 109 to 116, Chapter 108, Old Quarrels, Skepticism toward the Old Men for advanced chapters /Patreon. com/handsomeduckgod, venting his anger. Ethan kept his voice mild. Lily Snow glanced toward the larger side table where Garrison Pike was holding court with two other students, then leaned closer. You remember the woman he mentioned earlier? Yvette Caldwell. The proprietress. That's her. She's also one of teacher's students. Strictly speaking, she's a junior of mine, and a senior of you by ordination. The reason she has this restaurant is a long story, but it's hers, and teacher visits when his schedule allows. Ethan's eyebrows climbed. The proprietress, whose calligraphy collection alone suggested a person of extraordinary connections, was a fellow disciple of Hargrove. He filed the fact away, and turned his expression into something appropriately surprised for a wide-eyed junior. That's incredible. Why isn't she at the dinner tonight? Lily's expression flickered. The cheerful warmth faded into something more careful. That you'd have to ask teacher. None of us are really in a position to explain it. The deflection was clean, but the deflection itself was information. There was a story. Lily knew it. And the story wasn't the sort one shared with a new junior at a public dinner. Ethan didn't push. He gave her the friendly, slightly disappointed shrug of a young pupil who had been gently warned off a topic and changed direction. Then is there something between Senior Garrison and the proprietress? He seemed angry about her in particular. That, Lily was willing to discuss. She glanced again at Garrison, lowered her voice, and gave Ethan the short version. Old relationship trouble. Yvette was the most beautiful student in her cohort at Hartwell. The most pursued by every metric. During orientation week the boys swarmed her so thoroughly she could barely walk to class without an escort. Garrison was one of them. More than one of them. From what I heard, he was the one who personally talked her into pursuing her graduate work under teacher. He convinced her it was the right academic move. The right intellectual mentor. And, less explicitly, that being his fellow student would allow them to develop a relationship in parallel. Lily took a small sip of her tea. It didn't work. Yvette's standards are extremely high, and Garrison, accomplished as he was, did not meet them. She turned him down, multiple times, over a period of about 2 years. He took it badly. And ever since then, every time her name comes up at one of these gatherings, he has something cutting to say. He doesn't show his face at her restaurant, except when teacher requires us all to be in the same room. The rest of us learned, years ago, that engaging with him on this topic is a waste of breath. She looked at Ethan with a small, regretful smile. So when he insulted you earlier, that was him taking out a 15-year grudge on the nearest available target. It wasn't actually about you. I'm sorry it caught you in the crossfire. Ethan nodded thoughtfully and looked toward Garrison Pike with an expression that, on the surface, registered as something close to sympathy. Love turning into bitterness, then bitterness into entitlement. Internally, the sympathy was less generous. Garrison had taken a private grudge from his student years, and weaponized it into a habitual public cruelty. Whatever he might have once been, he had let himself become a man who insulted strangers for failing to soothe his ego. That was a character that could not be fixed by hiring it. But more importantly, none of that excuses going at my parents and Frank and Linda by implication. Ethan kept his face composed. His patience, however, was already settled. Garrison Pike, on the other side of the room, was working on a parallel grievance. He had, in fairness to himself, made an honest mistake about the young man at the door. No one in this room would have intuitively guessed that Hargrove had taken on an 18-year-old new pupil. The misunderstanding was forgivable. But the proper response from a younger junior, in the wake of such a misunderstanding, was clear. The new arrival should have crossed the room with a teacup, made a small, modest introduction, apologized for the confusion he had inadvertently caused, and offered Garrison a respectful pour. That was the protocol. That was how social hierarchies in Hargrove's pupil line had always worked. Instead, the kid had been chatting comfortably with Lily Snow for the last 20 minutes. He had not approached. He had not apologized. He had not, in any visible way, acknowledged that he had committed a social misstep against the senior pupil in the room. Garrison felt in his chest the slow, hot wind of being disrespected. This little brat. After embarrassing himself, he's not even bothering to make the proper amends. He was about to stand up, walk over, and remind the new junior of the correct order of operations, when the door of the private room opened. Edmund Hargrove walked in. He had come directly from the lab. His coat was a touch rumpled, his hair was the wind-blown gray of a man who had not stopped to comb it, and he had the particular distracted alertness of someone whose mind had been on equations until 90 seconds ago. The room came to attention instantly. 8 students in unison rose from their seats. Even Garrison Pike, who had been mid-rise on his own grievance trip, switched smoothly into a respectful posture, as if his original intent had simply been to greet the teacher. Good evening, Doctor. Welcome, teacher. Thank you for the invitation, Teacher Hargrove. Hargrove waved a hand. You're all grown professionals at this point. Let's skip the ceremony. Sit down, all of you. Eat something. I'm starving. He moved toward the round table at the center of the room. Despite his casual instruction, none of his students actually sat down until he did. Hargrove understood the etiquette he was pretending not to enforce, and he settled into the head seat at the round table with the unhurried ease of a man who had earned the right not to perform his own status. His students filed toward the table. Garrison Pike moved with the practiced confidence of an established senior pupil. The seat to Hargrove's right, the place of primary honor, had been his at every gathering for the last 15 years. He had occupied it so many times that it had become muscle memory. He took 2 steps toward it. Hargrove, without looking up, raised his voice. Come over here. You're sitting with me tonight. He patted the seat to his right. The seat that had, for 15 years, been Garrison Pike's. Garrison stopped in mid-step. Every other student in the room paused. 8 pairs of eyes tracked, simultaneously, from Hargrove to Ethan and back again. For 15 years, Hargrove's pupil line had operated on a simple, observable principle: the teacher treated everyone equally. He did not play favorites. He did not promote one student above another. He had, in his entire teaching career, never publicly elevated one pupil's status over another at a formal gathering. Until tonight. The youngest pupil in the room, a teenager nobody had ever seen before, was being seated in the place of honor. Above the senior pupil who had occupied it for 15 consecutive gatherings. The room performed a silent, comprehensive recalculation. Who is this Evan Wright actually? Ethan, for his part, was trying very hard not to smile. He stood up from Lily's side table, walked across the room with the casual ease of a younger pupil being summoned, and passed within 2 feet of Garrison Pike on his way to the seat. He did not look at Garrison. He did not need to. He could feel the senior pupil's eyes burning a path along his shoulder. He sat down in the seat. Made a small, comfortable show of settling in. Adjusted the chair. Wiggled slightly as if testing the cushion. The seat you picked for me is really comfortable. Hargrove, suppressing a laugh, gave him a small sidelong glance that was not entirely free of mischief. Eat your soup, kid. Across the table, Garrison Pike's face had gone the color of an aged red wine. The veins on his forehead were visible from across the table. Lily, to her credit, did not visibly react. But her hand, moving toward her water glass, had a small, telling tremor of suppressed amusement. The meal proceeded. The first quarter hour was stiff. The students, having spent 20 minutes adjusting to the discovery that their teacher had a hidden young pupil, now had to spend another quarter-hour adjusting to the discovery that this hidden young pupil had been seated in their senior brother's traditional place. The conversation around the round table was professional and mannered, without the easy warmth that Hargrove's gatherings usually featured. Then the wine started flowing. Hargrove, despite being 91 years old, drank like a man 2 decades younger, and weighing 100 pounds more. Glass after glass disappeared into the old man's gullet without producing any visible effect. His students, who had observed this phenomenon many times, took turns approaching to offer toasts, and Hargrove accepted every single one with a calm, undisturbed grace that suggested he could continue this pace for another 3 hours and not miss a step. Ethan watched in private awe. He had the supersoldier serum running through his veins. It had multiplied his physical capacity in every measurable way. And he was reasonably sure that, in a head-to-head drinking contest, the 91-year-old man at the head of this table would beat him cleanly. The man's liver is a national treasure. While the students made the rounds, Hargrove, sharp-eyed as always, had noticed that Ethan was avoiding any reference to his actual identity. The boy had introduced himself to Lily as Evan Wright, and the name had spread to the rest of the group in the last hour. None of the senior pupils had connected the name to anything notable, which was reasonable, because the name was an invention. Hargrove understood the move immediately. The boy was running an unannounced character evaluation. He wanted to see how each of these students treated a young, unimportant junior pupil before they knew his actual identity. It was a smart move. Hargrove approved of it. So as he spoke during the dinner, he did not, at any point, mention Ethan's real name. He did not introduce him formally. He simply referred to him as the kid, and your junior brother, and let the other students draw their own conclusions about who he was, and where he fit in the hierarchy. By the time the third bottle of wine had emptied, Ethan had a clear mental picture of every person at the table. Lily Snow was warm and competent. Genuinely kind. The social glue of the group, exactly as she had presented herself. Olivia and Teresa, 2 more senior pupils, were thoughtful and well-spoken. They had treated him with appropriate friendly curiosity since the introduction, neither too distant nor too obsequious. Marcus and Gregory were sharp and slightly competitive, but their competitive instinct was pointed at academic and professional achievement, not at peers. They were the kind of men who would push themselves harder if a colleague did good work. Useful traits in a startup. Daniel and Annika were quieter, more reserved. They listened more than they spoke, but the listening was attentive. The questions they asked Ethan, in the brief moments they engaged him directly, were thoughtful and probing without being intrusive. And Garrison Pike was a tyrant. Not just in the dramatic sense of the senior pupil who insulted strangers. The smaller, daily life sense. He talked over Annika twice. He made a snide remark at Daniel's expense. He laughed too loudly at his own jokes. He referred to 2 of the younger pupils, in their hearing, as the junior pair rather than by their names. The other 7, by and large, had reasonable characters. Hargrove had vetted them well. Any of them would be a defensible hire, and several of them would be genuine assets. Garrison Pike, however, would never set foot inside New Future Technology Energy Company. Not as long as Ethan Mercer was alive. Plates cleared. Hargrove tapped his glass with a chopstick. Down to business. The students fell silent. You've all been wondering why I called this gathering early in the year. Most of you know my schedule. I don't typically organize these dinners until the autumn. So if I've pulled you off your projects and routes in the middle of the working season, it's for a reason. He gestured toward Ethan. This is for the kid. 8 pairs of eyes turned toward Ethan with renewed attention. Your young junior brother is starting an energy company. Initial capitalization is in the 10-figure range. State support has already been secured. The technical foundation is, in my professional opinion, the most significant scientific breakthrough in the energy sector in the last 50 years. He paused. He needs senior staff. Research division leadership, operations, commercial strategy, infrastructure deployment. I've gathered all of you here so he can interview those of you who are interested in joining the company at senior levels. The reaction was instant. An energy company. Privately owned. That's not allowed under Republic law. How much capital? Did he say 10 figures? That's not even possible. The state would never authorize a private. Teacher, with respect, even if it's a real proposal, the regulatory burden of starting an energy company in this country is. What's his technical foundation? What does the kid have that the established firms don't? The questions overlapped. The skepticism was open, professional, and reasonable. Every student at the table had spent their career in the energy sector or adjacent industries. They knew, viscerally, how impossible the proposal sounded. After the initial wave of disbelief came a second, quieter wave of reluctance. The students at this table were not unsuccessful. Each of them, by Hartwell standards, had reached the upper tier of the energy industry through a decade or more of hard work. Garrison Pike, the most successful among them by any metric, was the chief operating officer of a major foreign energy conglomerate, drawing a compensation package that several of his juniors envied. Even the less senior pupils, like Lily, were holding senior research positions at established firms. To leave those positions, to walk away from established careers, in order to join an unproven startup founded by a teenager they had just met. It was, several of them thought silently, an absurd proposition. Lily, to her credit, kept a kind expression on her face, and tried not to let her dismay show. But the dismay was there. She had been pulled out of her routine for what she had thought was an academic gathering, and instead she was being asked to consider career suicide. The other students were less able to mask their reactions. Garrison's face, in particular, had transitioned through several discrete emotions: surprise, contempt, and finally a slow, satisfied amusement at the realization that this entire dinner had been organized for the benefit of the new junior pupil. So that's what this is. The old man is using us to bail out his pet project. Hargrove watched the reactions with a calm, weathered patience. He had expected this. The students did not have the access to information that he had. They did not know about the deep-water reactor in the Southern Sea. They did not know about the 10-reactor plan being discussed at the highest levels of the Energy Ministry. They did not know about the Stark element. They did not know that the teenager in the seat beside him was the most consequential physicist of his generation, and was about to redefine the global energy landscape. To their eyes, this looked like an old teacher trying to recruit them into a doomed startup founded by a favored pupil. But Hargrove knew differently. He knew, with the clarity of a man who had spent 50 years reading the political and scientific tea leaves of the Republic, that New Future Technology Energy Company was going to be one of the most valuable companies in the world within the decade. The startup phase would be brutal, demanding, and slightly chaotic. But the founding employees, the people who joined in this earliest window, would be the ones who shaped the company's culture, took on its first major projects, and accumulated equity and influence as the firm grew. The students at this table did not yet understand that they were being offered ground floor entry into a future Fortune 10 firm. They thought they were being asked to take a foolish risk. They were being offered a generational opportunity. The gap between perception and reality was enormous, and Hargrove was about to spend the next phase of the dinner trying to bridge it. He took a long sip of his wine, set the glass down, and looked at his students with the particular gentle exasperation of a teacher about to deliver an uncomfortable lesson. All right. Hear me out. Chapter 110, Chapter 109, The Proprietress Appears, A Quiet Climb. 2637 words for advanced chapters /Patreon. com/handsome duck. God Garrison Pike had been waiting for this moment. He looked across the table at the silent students, gauged the temperature of the room with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his career managing exactly these kinds of social pressures, and chose his line. Teacher, please don't misunderstand. His voice was warm. Reasonable. The voice of a senior pupil being respectful even as he disagreed. It isn't that we want to refuse a request from you. None of us would do that without serious consideration. But we have aging parents at home. We have children. We have spouses who depend on our salaries. He let the words land. If we resign from secure positions to take a flyer on our junior brother's startup, who supports our families when the company fails? Who pays our mortgages when the seed capital runs out in 18 months? Forgive me for being blunt, teacher, but you're asking us to gamble with our families' futures, and we have a duty to those families that comes before our duty to fellow students. The other students nodded. The argument was sound, expressed with appropriate respect, and grounded in concerns that were genuinely difficult to dismiss. The redirection worked perfectly. The students who had been quietly skeptical of the proposal were now openly skeptical, and the focus of their displeasure had shifted. They could not, by any standard of pupilline decorum, voice their frustration at Hargrove. So the next best target became the new junior brother whose existence had created the proposal in the first place. The looks Ethan had been receiving for the past hour, ranging from curious to friendly, hardened. In the seat beside Hargrove, Garrison Pike permitted himself a private flash of satisfaction. Reaching the COO position at a major foreign energy conglomerate had taught him many things, and chief among them was how to redirect a room's emotional momentum onto a target of his choosing. He had done it cleanly. The kid in his old seat was about to learn what happened to junior pupils who failed to show proper respect. In the seat beside Hargrove, Ethan kept his face composed and quietly noted that this was the second time in a single evening that Garrison had taken an unprovoked shot at him. The first had been the ill-mannered waiter line at the door. That had been an attack on his upbringing. This second one was an attack on his viability as a peer. A more subtle attack, dressed in the language of family responsibility, but functionally the same. Garrison was using the room's momentum to position Ethan as the unwelcome cause of an unwelcome conversation. The pattern was now clear. Garrison Pike had decided, on first sight, that he disliked the new junior pupil. He was going to take whatever shots he could, whenever he could, until either the kid responded or the dinner ended. Ethan considered his options. He could announce his identity right now. The room would reorient instantly. The 7 students would, having just spent 10 minutes voicing skepticism, find themselves desperately backpedaling. Garrison Pike, having spent 2 hours building a campaign of small humiliations against a fictional teenager named Evan Wright, would have to confront the fact that he had been insulting one of the most powerful young men in the Republic. It would be satisfying. It would also be an unworthy way to end the dinner. Hargrove was at the table. The old man had organized this gathering specifically for Ethan's benefit. Turning it into a dramatic identity reveal would embarrass Hargrove's other students unnecessarily and ruin the evening's stated purpose. There would be other opportunities to settle accounts with Garrison Pike. Tonight was not the right one. Ethan took a slow breath, set his expression to something composed and serious, and prepared to stand up to introduce himself in a less theatrical way. He had every intention of revealing his identity. Just calmly. Just enough to defuse the situation without humiliating anyone. He never got the chance. The door of the private room opened. A woman walked in. The room went silent. She was wearing a rose-red cheapao in a classic cut, the high collar at her throat closed with a small fabric clasp, the slit at the side reaching to mid-calf. The fabric draped over her frame with the precision of a garment that had been tailored to her exact measurements. A fox fur wrap was draped over her shoulders against the late winter chill. The total effect was striking in a way that did not depend on the cut or the fabric. The garment fit the woman, and the woman wore the garment, and the unity of the two produced something that registered, on first impression, as almost ceremonially beautiful. Ethan, who had encountered a number of striking women over the past year, found himself genuinely surprised. The Hartwell student Daria Pierce had been pretty in the warm, friendly way of a young woman comfortable with herself. Helena Marsh had been beautiful in the sharp, classical way of a model in a glossy editorial. Both of them had been, by any reasonable standard, attractive. The woman who had just walked through the door was operating in a different category entirely. Around the table, every other set of eyes had also locked onto her. Garrison Pike's reaction was the most pronounced. The carefully constructed composure he'd been wearing all evening evaporated in a single instant. The face he turned toward the doorway was open, undefended, and naked with a longing that he had clearly not anticipated needing to manage tonight. His mouth opened slightly. His hands tightened on the edge of the table. Whatever 15-year resentment he had been quietly carrying did not, at this moment, appear to be the dominant emotion in his chest. The woman did not look at him. She did not look at any of the other students. She walked the length of the room with the unhurried, intentional grace of a person who knew the room was watching her and chose not to acknowledge it. She arrived at the round table, walked the half-arc to Hargrove's other side, picked up the wine carafe, and poured herself a glass. She raised the glass to Hargrove. "Your student Yvette Caldwell offers a toast." Her voice was clear and level, with a slight, measured weight that suggested she was making this offering carefully, rather than casually. She drank without waiting for Hargrove's response. For a long moment, the old man simply looked at her. The gathering around the table held its collective breath. Then Hargrove, slowly, picked up his own glass. The exchange had no spoken meaning attached to it, but the room understood it as a small ritual that mattered. Yvette Caldwell, the proprietress of this establishment and Hargrove's pupil, had offered a formal acknowledgement to her teacher. Hargrove, after a noticeable pause, had accepted it. The pause itself was information. Ethan, watching the exchange, registered the tension between teacher and pupil as something that had not been resolved. The two had history. The history was not pleasant. The toast was a gesture across that history, and Hargrove's acceptance was reluctant. Lily had warned him there was a story. He could now see, in the air between Hargrove and Yvette, the rough shape of that story. Yvette set her glass down, gave Hargrove a small bow, and turned to the rest of the room. "Senior pupils. Junior pupils. Forgive me. I have administrative work to attend to. Please enjoy the rest of the evening, and let any of the staff know if you need anything." She did not look at Garrison. She did, briefly, look at Ethan. The look was about a second long. The eyes that met his were dark, intelligent, and faintly curious. Hargrove had retired from active teaching a decade ago, which meant the active disciples in the pupil line should have all been people Yvette already knew. She did not know the young man at the head of the table. A new pupil, taken late. A junior of an unusual kind. The look held for one more half-beat, and then she turned and walked out of the room with the same unhurried grace she had entered with. The door closed behind her. Garrison Pike stared at the closed door for several seconds before recovering his composure. The veins at his temples were visible. The look in his eyes had shifted from longing into something darker. If Hargrove had not been at the table, Ethan suspected, Garrison would have stood up and gone after her. Hargrove, for his part, looked drained. The old man drank 2 more glasses of wine in silence. The cheerful weather of the early evening had clouded over. After the second glass, he put his hands flat on the table and pushed himself up. "You handle the rest of the briefing. I'm going home." The students all stood. "Sit, sit. The kid will see me out. The rest of you keep eating." Hargrove gestured Ethan toward the door, and the two of them left the private room. The cold winter air outside the restaurant was bracing after the warmth of the inner courtyard. A black sedan was parked at the curb, the driver standing patiently beside it. Hargrove paused before getting in. He turned to Ethan. His grip on the boy's hand was unexpectedly firm. "Listen to me." "I'm listening." "That girl Yvette. Take her on at the company." Ethan's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Hargrove. Hear me out before you say anything. She's not in research. She has no academic background past her degree, and even that was a graduate program in management theory rather than physics. So as a candidate for your science division, she is not competitive." He paused. "But for operations, commercial leadership, and corporate management, she is the best person you will ever meet. 2 years out of Hartwell, with no family money behind her, no connections to corporate Valoria, no patron and no inheritance, she has built a personal fortune in the 10-figure range. From nothing. That kind of trajectory is not luck. That is operational genius. Ethan absorbed the number and felt his understanding of Yvette Caldwell expand significantly. A beautiful proprietress with extraordinary calligraphy and political connections was one impression. A young woman who had built a personal fortune from nothing in 2 years, in a country whose business culture was dominated by old money and family connections, was a different impression entirely. The first was a curiosity. The second was a higher on-sight. She needs a bigger stage, Hargrove said, quietly. She's outgrown what she has here. Your company is the right scale for her. Do me a favor. Bring her on. Whatever the role she wants, give it to her. The old man's voice had a quality Ethan had not heard before. Not the affectionate teasing of their usual exchanges. Not the firm but warm authority of a teacher correcting a pupil. The voice was quietly imploring. Hargrove, who had never asked Ethan for anything, was asking for this. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. He had 100 questions he could have asked. About the tension at the table. About the toast. About what had passed between them, that the old man would have to stand on a winter sidewalk asking a favor for a former pupil he was apparently estranged from. He chose not to ask any of them. If you ask, I do it. That's how this works. He gave the old man a small, reassuring smile. Honestly, even if she had no qualifications at all, the fact that you're vouching for her would be enough. She can have any role she wants. Hargrove's face softened. For a moment, the old man looked his actual age. Slightly small. A 91-year-old who had carried something for a long time, and had just been quietly relieved of part of the weight. He patted Ethan's hand once. Got into the car. The driver closed the door, walked around to the front, and the sedan pulled away from the curb. Ethan stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the taillights disappear down the block. Then he turned around and walked back into the restaurant. He did not, however, return to the private room. He stopped a passing waiter in the corridor. Excuse me. Could you tell me where the proprietress's office is? The waiter stopped, glanced at Ethan, and gave him the polished, patient smile of a service professional who had heard this question many times. I'd recommend returning to your meal, and not pursuing the question further. He bowed slightly and continued on his way. Ethan watched him go, and made a small face. The line was practiced. The waiter had clearly delivered it dozens of times to dozens of male patrons who had decided, at various stages of various dinners, that they would like to introduce themselves to the beautiful proprietress. The restaurant had, evidently, developed a polite institutional defense against this exact behavior. Which meant the proprietress had, in turn, developed an institutional reputation for not appreciating uninvited visits from interested male patrons. That made the conventional approach unworkable. It also made the unconventional approach more interesting. Ethan slipped into a quiet hallway, raised his wrist to his face, and spoke softly. I need you to scan the building. Of course, sir. What am I looking for? Yvette Caldwell. Her office. I need her exact location. A faint red glow swept the inside of his watch face. The scan took less than 3 seconds. I have located a biological signature matching the parameters of the woman who passed through your room 9 minutes ago. She is currently in a room at the southwest corner of the 3rd floor. The room has its own external balcony. I am detecting one occupant, presumed her, no other personnel within 30 feet. Ethan left the corridor, exited through a service door at the back of the restaurant, and circled around to the southwest corner of the building. The exterior wall was an older brick construction with the kind of weathered, irregular masonry that offered handholds at intervals. To a normal climber, a 3rd-floor balcony would have been a dangerous proposition. To Ethan, with the serum running through his nervous system, the climb was barely above the difficulty level of walking up a flight of stairs. He set his hands against the wall. He climbed. Above him, the soft glow of a window on the third floor marked his destination, and within that window, the silhouette of a woman in a rose-red cheapao, working at a desk. Ethan kept his movements quiet. This was, he reflected as he scaled the wall, not a remotely conventional way to recruit a future executive. But Hargrove had asked him to do this. And the proprietress had built a billion-mark fortune from nothing in 2 years. That was not a person who would be impressed by conventional approaches. He reached the balcony railing, swung himself up over the edge, and landed on the polished stone of Yvette Caldwell's private balcony with the soundless precision of a serum-enhanced predator. Inside the office, the woman at the desk paused. She did not look up. But her hand, which had been writing, stopped moving. She set the pen down very carefully. Then, in a calm, clear voice that carried through the slightly open window with no visible effort, "You can come inside, whoever you are. The window is unlocked." Ethan stopped halfway across the balcony. He had been making no sound at all. He grinned despite himself, walked the rest of the way to the window, and pushed it gently open. Chapter 111, Chapter 110, The Proprietress, Privately, a compromising scene 3022 words for advanced chapters /Patreon. com/handsomeduck. Yvette Caldwell stepped into her office, and let out a long, careful breath. The walk back from the private room had been tense. The toast itself had cost her something. Her relationship with Hargrove had been strained for years, and offering a public acknowledgement after such a long silence had taken more emotional preparation than the surface-level grace of the moment had suggested. Standing in the doorway of her own office, with the door closed behind her, she finally let her shoulders drop. She crossed to the small recess at the side of the room. With practiced movements, she unbuckled the rose-red shoes that matched her cheapao, and stepped out of them, letting her bare feet sink into the white wool of her office carpet. She walked the length of the room, picked the lock on a tall cabinet she kept by her desk, and opened it. Inside, instead of the leather-bound dossiers, archival ledgers, and confidential files that the office's executive aesthetic suggested, were rows and rows of snacks. Salted plums. Caramel popcorn. Several varieties of imported chocolate. A box of dried mangoes she had been rationing for 2 weeks. Wafer cookies. 3 different brands of potato chips. A small jar of glass-bottled honey that she ate by the spoonful when stressed. She gathered an armful of supplies, walked back to the carpet, and dropped them in a small heap. She lowered herself onto the floor beside the heap, crossed her legs the way a much younger version of herself would have, and began the careful, unhurried business of selecting a snack. Outside this room, Yvette Caldwell was the proprietress of one of the most exclusive establishments in the capital. A self-made entrepreneur with a personal fortune in the 10-figure range. The cool-mannered, self-possessed woman whose calligraphy collection rivaled that of senior politicians, and whose quiet refusal of certain men's advances was the source of 15-year grudges. Inside this room, with the door locked and the world held at bay, she was a 28-year-old woman who liked sweets, and had never quite figured out how to sit elegantly on the floor. She had earned this version of herself. She got about 90 seconds of it before someone climbed in through her window. On the exterior wall of the building, Ethan was making good progress up the 3rd story. If the location had been more public, or the lighting better, he would have abandoned the climb on principle. The last thing he needed was for tomorrow's national news cycle to feature a viral video of him scaling the side of a restaurant. He could already imagine the headline, "Young scientist Ethan Mercer caught climbing a famed proprietress's wall by night." Fortunately, the alley along the southwest face of the building was unlit, the side street beyond was sleepy at this hour, and the architecture of the older quarter put plenty of weathered handholds in convenient places. He kept his pace measured and his weight close to the wall. Internally, he was still working through his irritation. The waiter's polite refusal downstairs had been a small dignified pebble dropped into the lake of his evening, but the exchange had been worse than the refusal itself. The waiter's eyes, in the moment of refusal, had carried a clear subtext that Ethan had read with the particular sensitivity of any young man who had ever been gently dismissed. "Look at yourself, kid. You think the proprietress is interested?" He found, climbing the wall, that the look bothered him. He had two consistent emotional triggers in life. The first, and the more important, was anyone insulting his family. Frank, Linda, his deceased parents. That was the line that could not be crossed. The second, less defensible trigger, was anyone underestimating his face. Ethan was aware, intellectually, that he did not have leading man features. The serum had improved his physique substantially, but it had not given him cinematic bone structure. His face was, at its kindest, pleasant. By any honest evaluation, the looks ledger of his existence sat somewhere between average and slightly above. He had made peace with this in adolescence. He had told himself it didn't matter. He had focused on building a future that was about competence, not appearance. And then he had taken the serum, and had picked out his outfit, and the barber had cleaned up his hair, and for the first time in his life, he had stood in front of a mirror that morning and thought, I look genuinely good. 3 hours later, a waiter at a fashionable restaurant had communicated, through one efficient look, that Ethan was nowhere near the league of the proprietress. The audacity of it, Ethan thought, scaling the second-floor cornice. The pure, undisguised audacity of that look. I am wearing a 12,000-mark suit. I have a custom haircut from a place that books up 2 weeks in advance. I am in arguably the best shape of my entire life. And this man took one look at me and decided I was wasting my time. The injustice fueled him up the next handhold. This entire climb, he reminded himself, is not for personal reasons. This climb is purely for the sake of New Future Technology Energy Company, and the future of clean energy in the Republic of Valoria. This is a recruitment mission. I am acting as a senior executive of my company, in service to a strategic acquisition that will benefit both my firm and the country. This is absolutely not because I am annoyed at being underestimated by a waiter. He reached the third-floor balcony, swung himself over the railing, and dropped silently onto the polished stone. The window beyond the balcony was slightly cracked, allowing fresh air into the office. Through the gap, he could see warm yellow lamplight, and the white expanse of an interior carpet. He took a step toward the window. The cool, composed proprietress who had walked through the dining room downstairs in a rose-red cheapao with the imperious grace of a woman accustomed to commanding rooms was, at the moment, sprawled on her belly across the white carpet of her office. Her shoes were off. Her bare feet were kicking absently in the air. She had a bag of caramel popcorn open beside her, a chocolate bar in one hand, and a salted plum in her cheek. She was, in the privacy of her own office, 28 years old, and very visibly enjoying it. For a brief, unwelcome moment, Ethan's brain failed to update its mental model of her. Oh, this is going to be much more difficult than I thought. Yvette Caldwell, lying on her stomach on her own office carpet, sensed the intrusion before she saw it. She had cracked the window for fresh air. She had not, however, expected the air she was getting to include a person. She raised her head, registered the silhouette on her balcony, registered the shape of the silhouette as a young man, and inhaled to scream. Ethan, sensing the scream incoming, made the decision that no future scientist should ever have to make. In 2 strides, he was through the window, across the carpet, and crouching beside her with one hand placed gently but firmly over her mouth. MMF, MMF. Senior sister. Senior sister. Look at me. I'm one of Hargrove's pupils, I was at the dinner downstairs, please don't scream, I'm here for a legitimate reason. She had been about to fight him. He could feel the tension in her shoulders coiling toward action. The word senior sister stopped her. She blinked, recognized him, and the readiness in her shoulders relaxed by a perceptible fraction. She held up one hand to signal that she was not going to scream, and Ethan, with significant relief, removed his hand from her mouth. There was a brief, awkward pause. Both of them were now keenly aware of the geometry of the situation. Yvette was on the floor in her cheapao with her shoes off. Ethan was crouched beside her after just having held his hand over her mouth. The room had a snow-white carpet, ambient lamplight, and an open window admitting cool evening air. Half the open snack supply was scattered around them like the aftermath of a small catastrophe. If a photographer had walked in at this moment, the photograph would have ended Ethan's career. He stood up. He took 2 careful steps backward. He kept his hands clearly visible. Yvette pushed herself up to a kneeling position, reached for her shoes, and slid them back on with the unhurried, dignified motion of a woman who had decided to recover her composure on her own timetable. She rose to her feet. She straightened the collar of her cheapao. She walked past Ethan to her desk, sat down in the leather chair behind it, and folded her hands neatly in front of her. The transformation, from sprawled on the carpet snack eater to composed corporate executive, took approximately 15 seconds. When she looked at him again, her face was calm, and her voice was very dry. Junior brother. Senior sister. I am extraordinarily curious about what could possibly motivate you to scale my building in the middle of a winter evening, and enter my private office through a third-floor window. The dryness was not anger. It was, Ethan realized after a moment, the specific dryness of a woman who had spent her professional life being approached by men with bad intentions, and was now genuinely curious whether this approach would prove to be unusual or merely a more athletic version of the usual. He cleared his throat. Senior sister. I am going to apologize before I explain. The apology is sincere. The explanation is going to sound bizarre. Begin with the apology and I'll evaluate as we go. I'm sorry. I should not have come up the wall. There was a way to do this that didn't involve trespassing on your private space, and I took the wrong way for the wrong reasons. She nodded, very slightly. Continue. Hargrove asked me to talk to you tonight. I'm starting an energy company. He's been concerned about the company's executive staffing for the operations and commercial divisions, and he's quite firm that you would be an excellent fit. He asked me, on the sidewalk outside this restaurant, to extend an offer to you for whatever role you'd like to take. Senior management or above. Yvette's expression did not change. He vouched for you with the kind of urgency I have not heard from him before. So I came up here to honor his request as quickly as possible. The waiters downstairs would not direct me to your office. I was either going to sit in the dining room until you eventually came back down, or I was going to find another way. And the other way was the wall. She looked at him for a long, evaluating moment. My junior brother, you are going to have to accept that the other way was the wall, is not a normal sentence. I accept that, senior sister. She let the silence sit for a second longer, then nodded once. Tell me about the company. Ethan, suddenly back on familiar ground, drew breath to speak. He never got the first word out. The door of the office burst open with the violence of a man who had not bothered to knock, and was operating on substantial alcohol momentum. Garrison Pike had finished an additional 3 glasses of wine after Hargrove, and Ethan had left the private room. The combination of the wine, the residual humiliation of being publicly displaced from his traditional seat, and the fresh shock of seeing Yvette Caldwell again, had pushed him past the threshold where his career-trained discipline could keep him composed. He had stood up from the table about 10 minutes after Yvette's departure, mumbled something about the bathroom, and had instead headed for the 3rd floor with the specific shaky determination of a man who had decided that this evening was going to end with him telling Yvette Caldwell exactly what he thought of her, and her of him, regardless of how many times she had previously declined the conversation. The waiters downstairs had attempted to stop him. He had brushed them off using his seniority in Hargrove's pupil line, and the waiters, lacking explicit authorization to physically restrain a guest at the senior pupil status, had not been able to fully intervene before he had reached the 3rd floor. He had reached Yvette's office. He had not knocked. He had pushed the door open. What he saw inside detonated the last of his self-control. Yvette Caldwell, the goddess of his 15-year fixation, was sitting at her desk, her shoes recently and visibly back on, her composure recently and visibly recomposed, with the new junior pupil standing across the desk from her in the soft yellow lamplight. Caramel popcorn was scattered on the carpet. A bag of salted plums lay on its side near her feet. The window was open. In the wine-flooded interior of Garrison Pike's mind, the available scene resolved itself into a single, devastating interpretation. The new junior pupil had somehow gotten alone with Yvette Caldwell. They had eaten snacks together on the floor. She had taken off her shoes. The window had been opened, presumably to cool down the room. If Garrison had arrived a half-hour later, he was reasonably sure of what he would have walked into. The humiliation, the 15-year accumulated rage, the shock of seeing Yvette warmer with the new junior than she had ever been with him, all of it converged into a single moment of catastrophic loss of self-control. The word ripped out of him at full volume. The room went very still. Across the desk, Ethan's face went through a fast, controlled cycle of reactions. The composed expression he had been wearing for Yvette's benefit cracked, briefly, into something dangerous. Then he locked it back down. Yvette's reaction was different. She did not flinch. She did not stand up. She did not visibly react to the slur at all. She simply lowered her hands to the surface of her desk, folded them, and looked at Garrison Pike with the specific cold expression of a woman who had been on the receiving end of his particular flavor of resentment for far too long. Garrison. Her voice was level. Controlled. Almost gentle. I have respected you as a senior pupil for 15 years. I have offered you patience well beyond what was deserved. She paused. You will leave my office now. You will not return to it. You will not speak to me again, in this building or any other, for the remainder of your natural life. If you violate any of these terms, the protection my standing in this district affords me will become available for the purpose of ending your access to my industry. The words were delivered without volume. They did not need volume. Behind Garrison, in the corridor, the sound of urgent footsteps approached. The head waiter, a muscular man in his 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of practice calm that suggested he had handled this exact situation before, appeared in the doorway with 3 other waiters behind him. I am very sorry. He represented himself as a senior pupil, and we were unable to confirm with you in time. He turned to Garrison. Please come with us. Garrison opened his mouth. He produced a sound that was, perhaps, intended to be a defense. The head waiter and his 3 colleagues did not wait for the sound to organize itself into words. They walked into the room. They each took an arm or a shoulder. They escorted Garrison Pike out of the office with the firm efficiency of men who had been trained, specifically, to escort intoxicated men out of this office. In the corridor, Garrison's voice rose into incoherent shouting. The shouting receded down the stairs, then down again, growing fainter as the waiters moved him toward the front door of the restaurant. Yvette closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked at Ethan with an expression that combined exhaustion and dark amusement. That junior brother was Garrison Pike. I gathered. I would like to apologize on behalf of the pupil line for what you just witnessed. You don't owe me an apology, senior sister. He doesn't represent the pupil line. She gave him a small, tired smile. You're being kind. She gestured at the chair across from her desk. Tell me about the energy company. Outside, in the front courtyard of the restaurant, Garrison Pike was being dumped into a cab. The waiters had, with admirable patience, ensured he was placed in the vehicle without injury. They had paid the driver's fare in advance to Garrison's hotel. They had retreated. In the back seat of the cab, the cold winter air through the half-cracked window slowly returned a fraction of Garrison Pike's higher functions. Somewhere underneath the wine and the humiliation, a sober part of his brain was already working. He thought about what he had seen. He thought about what he was certain he had seen. He thought about the new junior pupil, the kid named Evan Wright, alone in Yvette Caldwell's office with the window open. He thought about how he was going to use this. His hand, sweaty against the cold leather seat, slowly closed into a fist. The kid had crossed him 3 times in one evening. The deference. And now this. Garrison Pike, swaying gently in the back of a cab, made a quiet decision about the trajectory of his next several months. The new junior pupil was going to be destroyed. The proprietress who had refused him for 15 years was going to be exposed. And Garrison Pike, by the end, was going to make sure both of them understood exactly who they had crossed. Chapter 112, Chapter 111, A Drunken Rampage, A Corporate Declaration 2963 words for advanced chapters /Patreon. com/handsomeduckgod. The conversation between Ethan and Yvette did not get to begin properly. The head waiter, who had been dispatched downstairs to oversee the eviction of Garrison Pike, returned at a half-jog. The careful institutional calm he had displayed earlier had developed a small, visible crack. "You should come down." Yvette's hand, which had been reaching for a teapot, paused. "What is he doing?" "He didn't make it into the cab. He came back inside, shoved past the doorman, and is currently in the front lobby. He's, addressing the dining room. Considerable." Yvette closed her eyes briefly. She rose from her chair, adjusted the collar of her cheapao, walked out of her office, and headed for the stairs. Ethan followed 2 paces behind. The two of them reached the second-floor landing, and they could hear it before they could see it. Garrison Pike's voice, amplified by alcohol and 3 flights of architectural acoustics, rolled up the central staircase in waves of slurred profanity. "Yvette Caldwell, you whore." A pause for breath. "I liked you. I liked you as a kindness. I liked you out of pity." Another breath. "And you turn around and open your legs for a teenager. You have no shame. No shame at all." Yvette stopped on the landing. Her face stayed composed, but Ethan, watching her closely, saw the small involuntary tremor in the hand that had reached for the banister. The slurs were rolling off the walls of her own restaurant, in front of her own customers, on her own watch. Whatever protections her business standing afforded her, Garrison Pike had just punctured several of them. She turned to a junior waitress who had followed them up. "Phone the police." The waitress nodded and pulled out her phone. Ethan's hand caught the waitress's wrist gently before she could dial. He turned to Yvette. "Senior sister. The police will take 20 minutes to get here. By then, every customer in the dining room has heard everything he has to say. And by tomorrow morning, every word he's said will be on social media. The damage is to your reputation. The police will not undo it." He paused. "Let me handle it." Yvette studied him. In her experience, when men volunteered to handle situations like this, the resolution involved violence. The violence usually made everything worse. She had spent 15 years carefully constructing a public reputation, and the prospect of a teenage boy fistfighting her drunk senior pupil in front of her dining room was not, on the face of it, a reputation-saving outcome. But Hargrove had vouched for this kid with a level of urgency she had not heard from the old man in years. And she could not, in fairness, do worse than the police call. "No violence," she said quietly. "If you put a single bruise on him in public, it reflects on teacher. He's still our senior pupil. No violence. I promise." She nodded once. He started for the stairs. "Junior brother." He stopped. "If you actually solve this," she said, with the composed dryness she'd recovered upstairs, "I'll consider the CEO position at your company." Ethan grinned at her over his shoulder, and went down the stairs. The first-floor lobby of the restaurant was, by the time Ethan reached it, the unwilling host to one of the more memorable scenes the establishment had ever produced. Garrison Pike was at the center, swaying, red-faced, slurring through accusations. Around him, in a loose ring, were the 7 other senior pupils who had been at the dinner upstairs. They had come down to try to manage him. Their attempts were not going well. "Brother Garrison, please. This isn't going to help anyone. Garrison, this reflects on teacher. Whatever you think happened upstairs, this isn't the way. Come back to the room. Have water. We'll talk." Garrison was not listening. He was, in his own internal narrative, the wronged party in a dramatic public confrontation, and the dramatic public confrontation was the entire point. Get out of my way. I am not the one who is embarrassing teacher. He flung an arm vaguely toward the upper floors. The proprietress and her little teenage lover. That is what is embarrassing teacher. The dining room patrons were watching with various combinations of horror and entertainment. This is unbelievable, one diner said quietly to his companion. I never imagined the cold proprietress had this side to her. A strapping young man. Who wouldn't be tempted? If I'd known the position was open, I'd have made my own offer. Yeah, I can teach all the same tricks as that little brat. Several patrons laughed. The laughter was the kind of casual, unconsidered cruelty that crowds produce when they think they're spectators rather than participants. The men making the jokes were not, in their own minds, attacking Yvette. They were merely making the kind of crude small talk that men make when a woman's name comes up. But the talk was being made in Yvette's lobby, in front of Yvette's staff, about Yvette herself, and the cumulative effect was the kind of damage to her reputation that took years to recover from. Ethan reached the foot of the stairs. The diner who had made the loudest joke was 3 steps to his left, wiping a small spill of laughter-sloshed wine off his sleeve. Ethan turned to him and spoke without raising his voice. If I were you, I would not say one more word. Not about her. Not in this room. Not in this restaurant. The diner, who had been having a fine time, turned around to deliver a sharp comeback. The sharp comeback died in his throat. The young man in front of him was not a college kid. The young man in front of him was, on closer inspection, calm in a way that calm men are not usually calm. The eyes were perfectly still. The voice was perfectly level. The face was relaxed. But there was, underneath the relaxation, something that the diner's animal brain registered before his social brain could override it. Ethan Mercer, in addition to being a teenage scientist with a custom haircut, was also a person who had personally walked through a burning intelligence headquarters in the Aurelian Republic and walked back out. He had been in 2 confrontations with armed assassins. He had killed people. He had absorbed the moral weight of having killed people, and absorbing that weight had changed his presence in a way that polite society did not have a vocabulary for. The diner, looking into Ethan's face, found himself unable to remember what his comeback had been. He nodded, very slowly. He took a small step backward. He turned and walked back to his table without saying anything else. Several of the other diners, who had been about to chime in with their own witticisms, suddenly became very interested in their food. A small bubble of silence opened in the lobby around Ethan. He walked through it. The crowd, without anyone consciously deciding to, parted in front of him. He walked directly to Garrison Pike, in the center of the cleared circle, and placed his right hand on Garrison's shoulder. Senior brother. You're drunk. Let's take this conversation back to the private room. The grip was light. To any observer, it looked like the polite, brotherly gesture of a junior pupil escorting an inebriated senior back to private quarters. Garrison, still mid-rant, started to swat the hand away. Get off me, you piece of... The pressure on his shoulder shifted. Not visibly. Ethan's expression did not change. His posture did not change. The hand on Garrison's shoulder did not move. But something happened underneath it. Garrison made a small, choked sound. The threat he had been about to deliver dissolved into a sharp, gasping wheeze. His knees, briefly, almost gave out. The pain was immediate. Compressive. As if the entire weight of a small building had localized itself onto a single nerve cluster between his shoulder and his collarbone. Garrison's body tried to twist away, and discovered that the hand on his shoulder was not negotiable. Garrison's head jerked up. His eyes locked instinctively on Ethan's. What he saw in the new junior pupil's face was not the polite teenager who had been playing along with the dinner all evening. It was something else. Something quiet and old and patient. The pupils of Ethan's eyes were the pupils of a person who had killed, and who was, in this specific moment, choosing not to kill. Garrison Pike, drunk as he was, understood the choice. His mouth closed. His muscles, which had been straining to break free, went still. Ethan, sensing the surrender, eased the pressure on Garrison's shoulder back to a polite, brotherly grip. "Let's go upstairs, senior brother." He guided Garrison toward the stairs. Garrison, walking on legs that had abruptly remembered how to cooperate, went with him. The other senior pupils watched the exchange with open astonishment. They had been arguing with Garrison for 10 minutes. They had been getting nowhere. The new junior pupil had walked over, said one sentence, touched his shoulder, and the violent drunk in the center of their dining room had quietly and obediently turned around to go upstairs. What kind of grip was that? What had he said? Lily, watching from the periphery, glanced at Ethan and then quickly looked away. She had felt, briefly, something cold in her own chest when Ethan had crossed the room. The kid she'd been chatting with for the last hour and a half was, evidently, not entirely the kid she'd been chatting with. She filed the observation away, deeply and carefully, for later. Back in the private room, Yvette was already seated at the round table, calm and composed, a fresh cup of tea in front of her. When Ethan entered with Garrison in tow, she did not look up. The other senior pupils filed in behind them. The atmosphere in the room had shifted considerably from the convivial dinner of an hour earlier. Nobody was eating. Nobody was drinking. Everybody was watching. Garrison, whose forced sobriety had been only partial, locked eyes with Yvette and immediately staggered forward. "I'm sorry. I lost my temper. I lost my composure. But you have to understand. I genuinely care about you. I always have. I just want you to give me a real chance." Yvette did not respond. She did not even shift her gaze. The cold, comprehensive silence she returned was the same silence she had directed at him 15 years earlier, when she had first turned him down. It was the silence of a woman who had made her decision a long time ago, and was not going to revisit it. Garrison's plea curdled in the space of about 3 seconds into something else. The fear that had quieted him in the lobby was, now, leaving him. The wine was still in his bloodstream. The humiliation of the public scene was still fresh. And looking at Yvette, looking at her composure, looking at the obvious ease she had with the new junior pupil who had managed to walk her down the stairs without incident, Garrison's wounded pride flared back up. He turned on Ethan with new heat. "What's so impressive about this kid?" He pointed at Ethan, his voice loud again. "Look at him. What's he ever done? Who is he? He's 18. He has no money. He has no career. He has nothing." Garrison straightened to his full height. His face flushed with the indignity of having to point this out. "I am the CEO of Maha Energy. I run the largest private sector energy firm in the global Fortune 500. My personal compensation last year was higher than the lifetime earnings of every other man in this room combined. I can give you anything. Property anywhere in the world. Influence at the cabinet level in 3 governments. You've turned that down for 15 years in favor of this. What can this nobody possibly offer you?" Around the table, the other senior pupils had gone visibly still. The mention of Maha Energy had introduced a new variable to the room. Maha was not a name to be invoked casually. It was the largest privately held energy conglomerate in the world. Its operations spanned 6 continents. Its political influence in the Aurelian Republic, the Meridian Commonwealth, and several smaller petrostates was such that geopolitical analysts routinely listed it as a non-state actor in their diplomatic frameworks. The firm had been known, on occasion, to put pressure on national energy markets sufficient to trigger fuel shortages in entire countries. And the CEO of that firm, who could allegedly pick up the phone and call an Aurelian senator or 2 on a casual Saturday, was currently shouting at a teenager in a Valerian restaurant. If Garrison Pike decided to hold a grudge, a teenager, even a famous one, would not survive the resulting commercial pressure. Several of the senior pupils began, very subtly, to put physical distance between themselves and Ethan. Whatever loyalty they had been forming during the dinner was, when weighed against Garrison's professional standing, not loyalty enough to position themselves on the wrong side of a Maha quarrel. Yvette, too, was watching Ethan with a new kind of attention. Not concern, exactly. Curiosity, more accurately. She wanted to see how he would handle it. Ethan, for his part, was at the limit of his patience. He had spent the dinner being insulted, dismissed, and eventually publicly slandered. He had handled it all with restraint because Hargrove was at the table, and because he had been gathering character information. Hargrove was no longer at the table. The character information had been gathered. And his patience, never a deep reservoir, had been exhausted. He scratched his ear lightly with one finger, and addressed Garrison Pike in the specific casual tone of a teenager dismissing a teacher he had decided he no longer respected. Maha energy is impressive. He let the word hang for a half-beat. As it happens, I am also founding an energy company. If CEO Pike has any spare time, he's welcome to come by for advice. We're hiring. The casual condescension landed. Garrison stared at him for a long moment. Then, to the astonishment of every senior pupil in the room, Garrison turned to Yvette and laughed. Look at this. This is what you chose. This is the boy you chose. He thinks his little startup is in the same conversation as Maha Energy. He thinks I'd advise him. This is a child playing at being an adult. He turned back to Ethan. Listen to me. Maha will buy your entire industry before you finish your incorporation paperwork. Your company is a joke. Your career is a joke. The only reason I'm being civil right now is out of respect for teachers' pupil line and UAA's establishment. Do not push your luck. Ethan, who had at this point made his decision about how the rest of the evening was going to go, did not push his luck. He did something different. I think you misunderstood me. His voice was perfectly mild. I wasn't asking for advice. I was telling you that my company is going to take you down. The next several years of Maha Energy's market position, the equipment manufacturing partnerships, the supply contracts in the Eastern Sea region, and the political relationships that have been keeping your firm afloat, all of it ends with my firm. You're going to spend the rest of your career watching new future technology energy systematically dismantle the empire you've built. He smiled politely. That was a declaration. Not an invitation. The room went absolutely silent. The 7 senior pupils stared at Ethan with expressions that ranged from disbelief to genuine alarm. A newly incorporated startup. Run by a teenager. Declaring corporate war on Maha Energy. It was not, even slightly, an ant trying to topple a chariot. It was an ant trying to topple a continental tectonic plate. The plate would not even notice the ant. The ant would simply be flattened in the routine movements of the plate's daily operations. Garrison Pike, after a moment of stunned silence, threw his head back and laughed loudly. The laughter was the laughter of a man who had been handed an unexpectedly generous gift. He had come to this dinner expecting to deal with personal grievances, and instead had been handed a teenager who had publicly committed business suicide in front of 7 witnesses. The kid had just declared war on Maha. By the end of the year, the kid would not have a company. By the end of 2 years, the kid would not have a career. Garrison's evening, which had been progressively deteriorating since the moment Hargrove gave away his seat, had just righted itself. Across the room, Yvette Caldwell looked at Ethan with a genuinely curious expression. She did not know, yet, what kind of card her new junior pupil was holding. But she had spent enough time at the highest levels of her industry to recognize that the kid had not, in fact, just committed business suicide. The kid had a play. She did not know what it was. But Hargrove had vouched for this boy, and Hargrove did not vouch for fools, and the way the boy had walked Garrison up the stairs without effort had told her things about him that she had not yet processed. She picked up her teacup, took a slow, deliberate sip, and decided to wait and see. Chapter 113, Chapter 112, Identity Revealed, a new CEO 2969 words for advanced chapters /Patreon. com/handsome duck god Garrison Pike, his pride still smarting and the adrenaline of his Maha energy declaration still in his bloodstream, laughed in Ethan's face. Take down Maha. He spat the words like they were too absurd to handle without a barrier between his teeth and the air. Who do you think you are? What does your startup have that competes with Maha? My subsidiaries have line item budgets larger than the lifetime capitalization of whatever you're putting together. I don't even need to involve myself personally. Any of my regional vice presidents could grind your firm into bankruptcy paperwork before the year is out. The other senior pupils, who had been silently absorbing the corporate war declaration, looked at Ethan with new caution. The math on its face supported Garrison. A globally recognized energy conglomerate did not get taken down by a teenager's seed-funded startup. The asymmetry was so extreme that the threat read as bravado, not strategy. Ethan let Garrison finish. He waited a half-beat after the last word for the room to settle. Then, in a voice that was perfectly calm and almost lazy, I wonder if the name, Ethan Mercer, carries enough weight in this conversation. The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Garrison Pike, mid-breath, froze. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the building's ventilation. Then, around the table, the recognition cascade began. Garrison Pike had spent the last 2 years working out of Maha Energy's Aurelian regional office. The geographic distance had not, however, insulated him from international news. He read 3 financial dailies and 2 political weeklies. He maintained a stable of analyst contacts who briefed him on Valerian developments. He was, in any meaningful sense, current on the affairs of his home country. The name Ethan Mercer was, in his industry, the most consequential single name to have emerged from the Republic of Valoria in 2 decades. The teenager standing across the room from him was the inventor of the nuclear fusion reactor. The designer of the powered armor that had embarrassed the Aurelian Republic's military on global television. The originator of the supersoldier serum. The creator of the sentient mechanical life forms designated transformers. The recently publicized founder of a state-backed energy venture that was, according to the most recent issue of International Energy Quarterly, expected to fundamentally alter the global energy landscape within 5 years. The Maha board, before Garrison had flown back for his vacation, had taken him aside personally. They had given him an unambiguous directive: if there is any opportunity to express the company's goodwill toward Ethan Mercer, take it. The directive had not extended to trying to hire him. The board, for all its institutional ambition, had been realistic about its standing. Mercer was already being courted by the Valerian government and the Aurelian intelligence community simultaneously. Maha had been told, in effect, to stay out of the way and try not to make enemies of him. Garrison Pike, in the last 20 minutes, had publicly insulted Mercer's adoptive family by calling him ill-mannered. Publicly displaced Mercer from a place of honor at his own teacher's dinner. Publicly slandered a woman closely associated with Mercer. Publicly declared Mercer's company a joke in front of 7 witnesses. Publicly informed Mercer that Maha Energy could and would crush his enterprise. The Maha board had given him exactly one strategic instruction regarding Mercer, and he had executed it in the precise opposite direction 5 times in 20 minutes. He was going to be fired. That was the first thought. The second thought, arriving a half-second later, was that being fired was, perhaps, the most optimistic outcome of his evening. Because Maha had competitors. The competitors had been quietly trying to recruit Mercer for months. If Mercer, in a fit of personal pique, decided to offer his next set of technologies to a Maha rival rather than to Maha itself, the global energy industry would reshuffle within 12 months. And the man whose drunken behavior had triggered the reshuffling would not, at the end of those 12 months, have a career in his industry. Garrison Pike, in the time it took Ethan to finish a single sentence, watched his entire professional life evaporate. Around the table, the other senior pupils were also processing. Their recognition was less industry-specific and more visceral. They had watched Ethan's face on national broadcasts over the past year. They had seen the press conferences. They had watched the Bumblebee reveal. They had read the same news articles every other educated Valerian had read. The reason they had not recognized him at the dinner was the haircut and the suit. The Ethan Mercer they knew from television was a younger, more casually dressed kid in worn shirts and a slightly disheveled fringe. The composed young man in the tailored blazer, who had been quietly observing them all evening, was a different visual profile entirely. But once the name was spoken, the resemblance clicked into place. Oh my God. Junior brother is Ethan Mercer. Hargrove took Ethan Mercer as a pupil. How did we not hear about this? My God, this is, I am sitting here right now, and I genuinely cannot believe it. Lily Snow brought her hand to her forehead and started laughing softly, the slightly hysterical laugh of a woman whose understanding of the evening was rapidly reorganizing. She had been the senior pupil who had defended this kid from Garrison's first insult. She had walked him to a side table. She had poured him tea. She had introduced him around. She had treated him with the careful, slightly protective warmth of an older sister. The kid she had been protecting had been, all along, Ethan Mercer. My junior brother, she said quietly, mostly to herself, is the most famous teenager in the Republic, and I didn't recognize him. Across the table, Yvette Caldwell parted her lips slightly. She had been mostly reserved during the recognition cascade, but the corner of her mouth had curled upward into a small, dry smile. The new junior pupil had entered her office through a third-story window. For an ordinary person, the climb would have been suicidal. For Ethan Mercer, who had walked through enemy compounds and survived multiple assassination attempts, the climb had been a Tuesday evening. The pieces in her mind were lining up. Garrison Pike, after the longest 5-second pause of his life, found his voice. He took 2 halting steps forward. Junior brother. The honorific was new. He had never used it. Junior brother, I had too much to drink. I said some things. I lost my composure. Please understand. You're a magnanimous man. Please don't hold this evening against me. He rubbed his hands together as he spoke. The motion was unconscious. His body was performing the deference his words were articulating, and the combination produced a posture of pure subordinate apology that, 2 minutes earlier, he could not have imagined producing. Ethan looked at him. The corner of Ethan's mouth lifted, very slightly. It was not a friendly expression. Senior brother Garrison. The honorific was returned with the dry flatness of a person noting a fact for the record. If I recall correctly, this is the first time you have called me junior brother in any of our exchanges this evening. Garrison's body bowed lower. I was confused, junior brother. The misunderstanding has been my fault from the start. Please, I apologize, please accept my apology. He started forward, perhaps intending to take Ethan's hand, perhaps intending to bow more formally. Ethan did not wait to find out. The honorific had reverted, the family name had been used, and the tone had gone from dry to surgical. I'm going to save us both some time. The room quieted. From the moment you used the word ill-mannered about me at the doorway of this room, I had decided you would never set foot inside any company I owned, ever under any circumstances. Tolerance is a virtue I respect. Magnanimity is a virtue I admire. I possess neither of them in any quantity that would survive an insult to my family. He paused. I do not let grudges sit overnight. They itch. I prefer to resolve them quickly. He folded his arms. When you return to your office in the Aurelian Republic, I would like you to deliver a message to the gentlemen on your board who have been so consistently interested in expressing goodwill toward me. Tell them that we are, as of this evening, opposed. Tell them that New Future Technology Energy Company is going to take their market share, their supply contracts, their political relationships, and eventually their corporate footprint. Tell them to brace for it. Tell them not to embarrass themselves resisting too publicly when the dismantling begins. Tell them, with my warmest regards, that they should have managed their personnel more carefully. The room was absolutely silent. Garrison Pike's face had gone through several distinct colors over the course of the speech. It had settled, by the end, on the specific gray of a man watching his own future be openly described to him as a cautionary tale. Junior brother. Please. You're still here. Mr. Garrison stopped talking. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Yvette. He looked at the other senior pupils, whose faces had all turned very deliberately neutral, the careful neutrality of people who had decided to be on the right side of an evolving political situation. Nobody was going to defend him. He took 2 stumbling steps backward, then turned and walked out of the private room without saying anything else. The door closed behind him with the quiet finality of a chapter ending. For a long moment, the room held its breath. Then Teresa, one of the quieter senior pupils, exhaled slowly and muttered, "That was the most professionally satisfying thing I've witnessed in 5 years." A small ripple of laughter went through the room. Lily reached for her glass of wine and took a long drink. The remaining senior pupils began, in earnest, the conversation that should have happened an hour ago. The mood had transformed entirely. Where there had been skepticism, there was now a frank, focused, professional interest. Where there had been wariness about leaving secure positions, there was now the quiet recalculation of executives who had just realized they had been offered a generational opportunity by the most consequential young inventor of the era. Junior brother, I want to apologize for my earlier hesitation about the company. I had not understood the technical foundation. Hargrove had been recruiting us for Ethan Mercer. No wonder teacher was so personally invested. With your inventions backing the firm, New Future will be in the Fortune Global 500 within 18 months. Probably sooner. If we're slow now, we won't get in at all. The competition for these positions will become impossible within a quarter. The shift was almost embarrassing in its completeness. The same senior pupils who, 20 minutes earlier, had been raising sensible objections about family responsibilities and career risk, were now actively lobbying Ethan for placement. Ethan, for his part, did not hold the about-face against them. He had spent his evening assessing their character. The about-face was rational. The objections an hour ago had been rational under the information they had at the time. Now that they had better information, they were updating. That was the behavior of competent professionals, not opportunists. He nodded. I appreciate the interest. I'm going to be making hiring decisions over the next month. Senior sister Lily. Yes, junior brother. Could I trouble you to compile resumes and areas of expertise for everyone here? Send them to me by the end of the week. I'll review them and reach out individually with placement offers. He produced a card with his direct contact information and handed it to her. Lily accepted the card with both hands, the way one accepts a document of significance. Of course, junior brother. By tonight, if you'd like. Whenever you can. The other senior pupils, sensing the conversation had transitioned into private corporate matters, began making their excuses. It was late. Their families were waiting. They had work in the morning. The dinner had run long and the unexpected developments of the evening had given them, each of them, a great deal to think about on the way home. There was also, several of them silently noted, the obvious unspoken matter that Ethan and Yvette appeared to have something they would prefer to discuss without an audience. Whatever Ethan's actual relationship with Yvette was, the dinner had clearly become uncomfortable for the proprietress, and the senior pupils, with the diplomatic sensitivity of people who had spent careers reading rooms, chose to give them privacy. The room emptied in stages. Bows, goodbyes, fresh introductions made on the new footing of junior brother Mercer. Within 15 minutes, only Ethan and Yvette remained at the round table. Yvette let the silence settle for a long moment. Then, with the deliberation of a woman who had decided to abandon any further pretense of corporate composure for the evening, she kicked her shoes off under the table, leaned back into the cushioned chair, and let one hand come up to support her chin. She looked at Ethan. The look was tired. genuinely tired. The accumulated tension of dealing with Hargrove's appearance, Garrison's harassment, and the public scene in the lobby had finally caught up to her, and she was no longer interested in performing the proprietress role for an audience of one. "All right, Mercer," she said. The honorifics had been retired by mutual unspoken agreement. "Sit down properly and tell me about your company." Ethan, who had been standing this entire time, lowered himself into the chair across from her. "You're really going to consider the position, then?" "I'm going to do considerably more than consider it." She gestured at the empty seats around the table. "You just publicly declared war on Maha Energy. You did it in front of 7 Hartwell alumni who will, by tomorrow, have told approximately every other Hartwell alumnus they know. By the end of the week, the financial press will have a version of this story. By the end of the month, every energy major in the world will know that you have personally committed to ending Maha's market position." She paused. "That is not a declaration a sane person makes without a credible plan. So either you have a credible plan, or you have lost your mind. I am going to assume, for the sake of this conversation, that you have a plan." Ethan took a slow breath. He had not anticipated, when he had climbed up the wall of this restaurant, that he would be giving a full strategic briefing on new future technology energy company to its prospective new CEO before midnight. But the situation had developed considerably faster than he had projected. "The plan starts with the technology base," he began. "Stark element fusion has commercial viability that current uranium cycle technology cannot match. The first operational reactor is already deployed in the Southern Sea. The state has authorized 10 additional units along the southern and eastern coasts. Each unit will produce roughly 10 times the energy yield of an equivalent cost conventional plant, at lower environmental cost, with zero accessible attack surface to foreign interdiction." Yvette's eyebrows climbed. 10 times the yield. Conservatively. We're modeling closer to 15 with the third-generation prototype. She was quiet for a moment. "When you say the state has authorized cabinet level, 10-figure capital injection. State minority stake at 15% for counterintelligence protection. The remaining equity is mine." She studied him. The skeptical, evaluating proprietress who had walked out of the private room 2 hours earlier was, internally, doing arithmetic. The numbers Ethan was describing were not the numbers of a startup. They were the numbers of an industry restructuring intervention. If the technology delivered even half of what he was claiming, the energy landscape of the Republic of Valoria would reorganize within 2 years. If it delivered everything he was claiming, the energy landscape of the planet would reorganize within 5. And the founder sitting across from her was 18 years old. She had, over the last decade, met every kind of operator the high end of her industry could produce. Family money heirs running inherited empires. Self-made entrepreneurs with billion-mark fortunes. Foreign nationals leveraging political connections. Old money scions trying to modernize their dynasties. She had never sat across from someone like the young man in front of her. She exhaled. "All right. All right. I'll take the CEO role. We're going to need to negotiate the package and the scope of my authority, but in principle I'm in." Ethan smiled. The first relaxed smile he'd produced all evening. "Senior sister, I think we're going to do very well together. Junior brother, I think we're going to scare a lot of important men." She picked up her teacup, raised it slightly toward him, and drank. Across the round table, in the quiet aftermath of the most consequential corporate recruitment of the year, the proprietress and the inventor agreed, without ceremony, to take the world apart together. Outside, on the streets of the capital, Garrison Pike was already in a cab on the way to his hotel, fumbling for his phone, trying to figure out how to draft an email to the Maha board that would soften the explosion he had set off. He would not, in the end, find words that softened it sufficiently. The board, by the following Tuesday, had already moved on without him. Chapter 114, Chapter 113, Obsidian Panics, 20 billion arrives 2798 words for advanced chapters /Patreon. Handsome Duck God. The private room had emptied of senior pupils, and the round table that had held a tense dinner 2 hours earlier now held only 2 people, a teapot, and the soft afterglow of business successfully transacted. Yvette Caldwell, still without her shoes, set her teacup down, and looked across the table at her new employer. Are you serious about Maha? Senior sister. The corporate war declaration. If your real grievance was Garrison Pike personally, there are easier ways to handle that. We don't actually need to take on a global energy conglomerate over a drunk man's evening. Ethan considered the question carefully. I'm a novice at running a business, but I understand the basic shape of the field. The global energy market is a finite pie. There is only so much demand, and the supply side is dominated by a small number of major players who have spent decades carving up territory and consolidating relationships. That's true. If I'm building a serious energy company, my growth has to come at someone's expense. Eventually, that someone will be the largest player in the segment. Maha is the largest player. The collision is inevitable. The question is timing, not whether. He shrugged. Tonight was a chance to choose the timing on my terms. I have a hostile witness who will personally carry the declaration back to the Maha board. The story will get out in a controlled way. Our investors will know I have a public commitment to dominate the market, which makes raising additional capital easier. Maha's investors will start asking nervous questions, which makes their next year of fundraising harder. Picking this fight tonight, while we're still small, costs us nothing. Picking it 3 years from now, when we're already a substantial competitor, would have cost us our first-mover advantage. Yvette listened in silence. She had, 2 hours earlier, been prepared to spend the evening cleaning up someone else's mess. She was now sitting across from a teenager, who was casually explaining to her the strategic logic of inviting global commercial warfare. The explanation was, to her professional ear, correct in every meaningful respect. She raised her teacup again, sipped, and gave a small nod. All right. We'll plan the campaign properly tomorrow. I'll have to brief myself on Maha's exposure points, and their political vulnerabilities. There are several lines of attack. I figured you'd know exactly where to push. She smiled. Also, junior brother, one detail. Senior sister. You told Lily Snow you'd be expecting an email from her tonight. I assume that means you gave her my phone number too, since you wanted me involved in the hiring process. Ethan blinked. I did, yes. How did you have my phone number? There was a brief, slightly tense silence. Ethan rubbed his nose with one finger, and produced his most innocent smile. Yvette looked at him for several seconds. Then she sighed in the particular way that suggested she had decided not to pursue this line of inquiry, at least not tonight. In Ethan's defense, in a world where Jay could extract a phone number from any unsecured commercial database in under 2 seconds, Yvette's contact information had been retrieved before she had finished pouring her first toast for Hargrove downstairs. The information warfare disparity between his side of the table and hers was, at this point, comically lopsided. She would learn this eventually. Tonight was, perhaps, not the night to lay the asymmetry out in detail. Across the planet, in the corner office on the top floor of a sleek glass tower overlooking the Aurelian Republic's largest tech corridor, the board of Obsidian Devices was watching a video. The video was 37 minutes long. It had been captured by an attentive Hartwell University freshman at the lecture earlier that afternoon, uploaded to the public video-sharing platforms within 90 minutes of the lecture's conclusion, and pulled by Obsidian's intelligence team about 40 minutes after that. By the time the board was assembled in the executive conference room, the video had been transcribed, time-stamped, technically annotated, and analyzed by 3 separate research teams. The room was silent. On the projection screen, Ethan Mercer was walking across the lecture hall stage, gesturing toward a holographic atom that was rotating in real, observable, 3-dimensional space at the center of a room full of undergraduates. The video paused. Bennett Carter, the chairman of the board of Obsidian Devices, leaned forward in his chair, folded his hands, and addressed the room. Gentlemen, He had a deep, even voice that he had spent 30 years cultivating for moments exactly like this one. The voice did not tremble. The voice did not betray fear. The voice simply established that the speaker had been doing this work for a long time, and had every intention of continuing to do it for as long as the speaker chose. What we have just watched is a working demonstration of complete holographic projection technology. Glasses-free. Multi-angle. Physically interactive with the surrounding environment. Combined with an apparently fully conversational artificial intelligence that interacts naturally with human audiences and conducts pedagogical instruction. He paused. If this Ethan Mercer extends his work into consumer software, operating systems, or personal device hardware, what does our defense posture look like? The silence held. After a long moment, one of the senior board members, a man named Helmsley who had been with the firm for 28 years, slammed an open hand against the conference table. I refuse to believe it. Helmsley. I refuse to believe that one teenager, with no industry foundation, no existing intellectual property portfolio in our space, no consumer brand, no established distribution channels, can credibly threaten Obsidian's market position. We have 1 billion active users globally. The brand loyalty alone. Brand loyalty is a function of product superiority, Carter said mildly. It is durable only as long as no competitor offers a meaningfully better product. Mercer just demonstrated, on a public university stage, that he has miniaturized real holographic projection to the form factor of a wristwatch. If he can put that into a watch, he can put it into a phone. If he can put it into a phone, our entire current display technology becomes obsolete within a single product cycle. He paused. As for the artificial intelligence, I want everyone in this room to consider the comparison honestly. Our current voice assistant cannot reliably answer the question, what is the weather tomorrow, without parsing errors. Mercer's J. was on this footage, conducting a fluid pedagogical exchange with an undergraduate physics class. Do not, please, let me hear about brand loyalty in a comparison with that. Helmsley's face flushed red. He did not respond. Carter rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. He had been chairman of Obsidian for 12 years. He had presided over the firm's transition from a regional supplier to the most valuable consumer electronics company on the planet. He had, during that 12-year period, faced exactly 2 competitors he had genuinely worried about. Both of them had eventually folded under Obsidian's market pressure. He was, looking at the paused video of the holographic atom on the screen, beginning to fear that the teenager in the well-cut blazer might prove to be the 3rd such competitor, and the first one Obsidian could not buy or out-execute. He turned his attention to the senior officer to his right. The 5 projection units that produced the demonstration in that lecture hall are currently installed in a classroom at Hartwell University. I want the detailed engineering parameters of those units, and I want them within 48 hours. Whatever it costs. I will authorize you to pull our top research technicians from every regional office on the planet to support your team. Understood, Mr. I want to see working prototypes of this technology in our own labs within 1 month. Yes, sir. Cooper stood up, gathered his briefing materials, and left the conference room at the brisk professional walk of a man who had been given an impossible assignment and intended to attempt it anyway. Carter watched him go with the slight, approving expression of an executive who had hired competent subordinates and was reaping the benefits. He turned to another board member, a heavier-set man with sharp eyes who handled the firm's project acquisition portfolio. You're going to the Republic of Valoria. Personally. I want you to make contact with Ethan Mercer, secure a private meeting, and open negotiations for the acquisition of the holographic projection patent and the J. Rodney's eyes narrowed. He produced a small, careful pad and a pen. Authorization parameters, sir. A small silence. Carter looked at the screen. He looked at the table. He looked back at the screen. $5 billion Aurelian dollars cash. Plus 5% equity in Obsidian devices. The conference room registered an audible reaction. $5 billion in cash was an unusually large acquisition figure even by Obsidian standards. 5% equity in the company, at current valuation, brought the total package value to over 40 billion. That was, in practical terms, the cost of a major mid-cap company. For two technologies. From a teenager. But nobody at the table voiced an objection. They had all just watched the video. They had all done their own internal math. The acquisition cost was, by any rational analysis, low. If Carter had said 20 billion plus 20%, no one in the room would have flinched either. Rodney nodded, made a careful note, and closed his pad. I'll have my team on a transport this evening. I'll initiate contact through the Aurelian Embassy in Valoria within 72 hours. He paused. Sir, one consideration. Mercer has reportedly become close to senior Valerian government figures. If our offer is interpreted as a foreign acquisition of a strategic asset, the Chancellor's office may intervene. Then we will not interpret it that way. Structure the offer as a private licensing arrangement with optionality. We will give Mercer the cash, take the technology rights, and let him retain notional ownership of his firm. The political optics will be cleaner. Understood, sir. Rodney left. The remaining board members exchanged glances. Carter turned his attention back to the screen. The holographic atom continued to rotate in soft blue light above the empty lecture hall. He was a long-tenured chairman of one of the most successful firms in the world. He had spent his career being the man other people feared. For the first time in 12 years, he was, very quietly, the one who was afraid. A similar scene was, at approximately the same hour, playing out in the executive offices of the Sentinel Group, the Aurelian Republic's second-largest consumer electronics manufacturer, and Obsidian's primary rival. A similar scene was, at slightly later in the night, playing out in the boardroom of a defense contractor based in the Meridian Commonwealth. A similar scene was, at slightly earlier in the morning, playing out in 3 different secure conference rooms in 3 different foreign capitals. In total, that night, approximately 60 senior executives, intelligence officers, and defense analysts on 4 continents were watching the same Hartwell University lecture video and arriving at variations of the same conclusion. A young man in a charcoal blazer was about to redefine several global industries. Nobody was sleeping well. Early the next morning, in his hotel suite in the capital, Ethan was woken by his phone vibrating insistently on the nightstand. The number was Graves. He groaned, rubbed his face, and accepted the call. Funds have transferred. Check your account. Ethan, who had been operating on 5 hours of sleep, blinked into the early gray light coming through the curtains. The state allocation. The state allocation. The capital injection authorized through Director Holt's office. I've been told to inform you that your bank card permissions have been upgraded to handle the new balance, so be careful when you actually try to spend any of it. The receiving institution flagged the deposit 3 times before they accepted it was real. Ethan, now reasonably awake, opened his banking application. The most recent transaction confirmation, time-stamped at 6 in the morning, displayed a credit line of 20 billion. 20 billion. The number had so many zeros that Ethan, for a brief moment, suspected the application of a rendering bug. He stared at the screen. He counted the zeros. He counted them again to make sure. The application was not malfunctioning. 20 billion marks. Wired into his personal corporate account by the Valerian Treasury, against the state's 15% equity in New Future Technology Energy Company. Ethan, who had grown up in a household where Frank and Linda counted change for the laundry machine, sat up in bed and made a sound that was somewhere between a wheeze and a small involuntary laugh. Director. 20 billion. 20 billion. That's a lot of marks. The state has given you every possible advantage on this project. Political cover. Counterintelligence support. Land allocations. If you cannot deliver on the seabed reactor program after we have given you this much help, I will personally. Graves trailed off. The threat he had been about to deliver did not arrive. He had remembered, midway through the sentence, that the recipient was a serum-enhanced teenager who had personally defeated trained Aurelian intelligence operatives in their own headquarters, and the practical viability of threatening him with physical violence was approximately zero. "I will be very disappointed," Graves finished, somewhat lamely. Ethan grinned. "Director, in 3 months at the most, I will have all 10 reactors deployed and online. The Eastern Sea power grid will be fed entirely from my company's facilities by the end of the calendar year. You'll get your money's worth." "I'd better. Oh, and Director, don't forget to reimburse my taxi fare from my last trip to your office." A long pause. "Get off my line, kid." The call disconnected. Ethan laid back in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, savoring the absurd warmth of having an unspendable amount of money in his bank account at age 18. Then he sat back up, swung his legs over the side, and started getting dressed. He had a CEO to meet for breakfast. By 8 in the morning, Ethan was back at Yvette Caldwell's restaurant. The front-of-house staff, who had spent the previous evening politely refusing to direct a strange young man to the proprietress's office, now bowed deeply when he walked through the door. The dining room was nearly empty at this hour. Yvette herself was seated at a corner table with a small breakfast spread, dressed casually in slacks and a cream sweater, working her way through a stack of documents she had clearly been reviewing for several hours. She looked up when Ethan approached. She raised an eyebrow at his expression. "Big Boss Mercer. What put that grin on your face?" Ethan, who had been making a small effort to look composed, dropped the effort entirely. He sat down across from her, pulled out his phone, and turned the screen toward her. She glanced at the screen. Her eyebrows climbed approximately 3 centimeters higher than the resting position they had occupied for the previous decade of her life. "Mercer, that is 20 billion. Is that 20 billion marks? In a corporate account you control?" She set the phone down very carefully on the table, the way one sets down a piece of delicate equipment one has been entrusted to handle without breaking. She picked up her teacup. She took a long, slow sip. She set the cup back down. "All right. We need to have a very different conversation than the one I had planned for this morning." She gestured at the empty chair beside her. "We have approximately 1,000 things to discuss, and we should probably get through the first 100 of them before lunch." Ethan sat down, accepted a plate of breakfast, and grinned across the table at his new CEO. The grin was, in fairness, still very wide. Yvette gave it a small, dry look. "You're so happy your back molars are showing." "Senior sister, this is the largest amount of money I have ever personally controlled, by a margin of approximately 20 billion marks. I am going to grin until I get used to it. That's going to take a while. Probably." She rolled her eyes, picked up her own fork, and they began to eat. Outside, the morning sunlight slanted across the restaurant's front windows. Inside, 2 young people who had agreed, the night before, to take the world apart, began the practical work of actually doing it. Chapter 115, Chapter 114, Site Selection, a disdainful owner 3302 words for advanced chapters/Patreon. com/handsomeduckgod. The morning's strategic conversation lasted approximately 40 minutes before Yvette folded her napkin, set it down with executive precision, and informed Ethan that they were going to do something about the new future technology energy company. Headquarters problem. "We can plan and budget all day, Mercer, but the company is currently registered to your hotel room. We need an actual building. Ideally before lunch. The faster we have a physical address, the faster we can publish a job board, and the faster we can start hiring. Every day without an address is a day your competitors are catching up." Ethan, who had been planning to spend the morning eating a leisurely breakfast and reviewing resumes, accepted the new schedule with the resigned good humor of a man whose CEO had been on the job for less than 14 hours, and was already reshaping his calendar. He called Bumblebee. The yellow sports car covered the highway between the capital and Ashford City in roughly half the time a conventional vehicle would have needed. Bumblebee, who had been in a sulky mood after spending the previous evening parked at Hargrove's residence while Ethan went to dinner without him, had reverted to enthusiastic engagement the moment Ethan slid into the driver's seat. The transformer had even, by the time they had crossed the city limits of Ashford, lowered the cabin temperature by half a degree to compensate for the unexpected presence of a second passenger. Yvette, in the passenger seat, noted the temperature adjustment, said nothing, and quietly added, "The car is sentient and is making decisions about my comfort," to the list of things about her new working life that she would need to mentally process at some point. By 11 in the morning, they were in Ashford City. By 11:30, they were sitting in a small cafe reviewing a list of candidate sites that Yvette had compiled overnight using contacts in the local commercial real estate community. By 12:15, they had narrowed the list to 3 properties. By 1 in the afternoon, they had visited 2 of them and dismissed both. The first had been a sleek, 20-story tower in the central business district that would have run them 10 times their target budget. The second had been a low-slung industrial campus on the western edge of the city that was beautiful and well-suited, but came with a litigation history Yvette refused to inherit. The third property was on Larkspur Avenue, in a quiet, semi-deserted patch of the Ashford City Development Zone, in a part of town that had been zoned for ambitious commercial expansion several years earlier and then, through reasons Ethan did not yet understand, abandoned. The building was a 31-story tower of glass and dark steel, clearly built within the last 5 years, sitting in the middle of a wide, empty plaza. The surrounding lots were undeveloped. The nearest restaurant was 3 blocks away. The nearest other functioning office building was 4 blocks beyond that. Yvette stepped out of Bumblebee, looked up at the tower, and let out a small thoughtful sound. "The location is remote." "That's correct. Significantly remote, Mercer. Your senior staff are going to have to travel an extra 30 minutes for lunch." "I considered that." He pointed at the empty lots that surrounded the building. "Our planned manufacturing facilities for the seabed reactor program are going to require considerable land. The Stark element synthesis reactors will need their own dedicated structures. The transformer assembly lines will need warehouse-grade space. If we set up in a prime downtown location, we either pay an astronomical premium for the central tower and lease industrial facilities separately, or we end up with our research office in one part of the city and our manufacturing operations 40 minutes away. Both options are operationally inefficient." He gestured at the empty plaza. "Here, we own the campus. The current tower is our headquarters. The surrounding lots are available for development. 5 years from now, this whole zone is our footprint." Yvette listened. Looked around. Nodded slowly. The reasoning was correct. New Future Technology Energy was not a downtown white-collar firm. It was an integrated energy and manufacturing operation, and integrated operations needed contiguous space. The development zone, isolated as it currently was, offered a foundation that no central city site could match. She made a small mental adjustment. "All right. We're seriously considering this one. Let me find out who owns it." She produced her phone, opened her contacts, and made 2 calls in rapid succession. The second call yielded a name and a phone number. She made 1 additional call, this time to the building's owner directly, and her voice took on the cool, courteous register of a senior executive setting up an unannounced visit. When she hung up, she was faintly amused. "The owner is coming. The address he gave me is a residential block about 6 kilometers from here. He says he'll be along shortly." "How shortly?" He didn't specify. He sounded sober but not crisp. "I'd guess he's been having a slow morning." Henry Whitlock, the owner of the building on Larkspur Avenue, had been having a slow decade. In his prime, Henry had been a professional investor with a reputation for unconventional risk-taking and an unusually good record of correct calls. 20 years of trading gold, futures, and private placements had built him a fortune large enough to support his family in comfort and his ego in slightly less comfort. He had, 5 years earlier, used most of his accumulated capital to fund the construction of the Larkspur Avenue Tower. The project had been based on a piece of insider information that Henry had been certain was reliable. The Ashford city government, he had been told, was preparing to rezone the development zone as a new commercial district, intended to relieve pressure on the overcrowded central city. Larkspur Avenue, currently a quiet semi-rural road on the outskirts, was projected to become a major artery serving the new commercial center. A 31-story Class A office tower, placed at the right intersection at the right time, would be the kind of investment that turned itself into a generational asset within 5 years. Henry had bet his family's savings on the call. He had built the tower. He had, 6 months after the building's completion, learned that the city government had quietly shelved the development zone rezoning plan during an administrative transition. The new mayor had decided to focus on residential expansion in a different quarter of the city. The Larkspur Avenue Tower, instead of becoming the centerpiece of a new commercial district, had become an isolated monument to one investor's expensive miscalculation. The building had sat empty for 4.5 years. Henry's family had not survived the shock. His wife had filed for divorce within a year. His adult son had moved to the Meridian Commonwealth and declined to return Henry's calls. His professional reputation, painstakingly built over 2 decades, had been demolished within the same 6-month period that he had lost his fortune. Henry had begun drinking. The drinking had not, in fairness, made the situation worse. The situation had been so catastrophically bad already that the drinking was merely a coping mechanism. But it had not, in turn, made the situation better either, and Henry's days had settled into the slow, sour rhythm of a man waiting to see what the universe planned to do with the remaining decade or two of his life. When his phone had rung this morning with a call from a woman expressing interest in the Larkspur Avenue building, his first emotion had been a sharp, surprised hope. His second emotion, on actually meeting the prospective tenants, was disappointment. He arrived by shared bicycle. The development zone did not have many shared bicycle docking stations, and the nearest one was about 3 blocks from the Larkspur Avenue Tower. Henry had pedaled the distance in a slightly disheveled mood, his thinning gray hair blown sideways by the wind, his sport coat wrinkled from the ride. He locked the bike. He walked the remaining distance to the building. He arrived in front of Ethan and Yvette panting slightly, his breath catching in the cold late winter air. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry to keep you waiting." Ethan smiled politely. "Not at all, Mr. Yvette," who had been watching the men arrive with the careful evaluating gaze of a senior executive sizing up a prospective business partner, gave a small, warm smile. "I appreciate you coming personally. It's quite admirable to see the owner of a building of this scale taking the trouble to handle his own showings. Very unpretentious." The compliment was, technically, courteous. It was also, in its phrasing, slightly barbed. The owner of a 31-story Class A office tower was not, in the normal course of business, the man who personally rode a shared bicycle to property showings. He had staff for that. The fact that he was here in person, on a borrowed bike, told Yvette more about his current circumstances than he likely wanted strangers to know. Henry, who had heard the barb without entirely registering it, was still mostly processing his first close look at his prospective tenants. The young man was unremarkable. A composed teenager in nice clothes, with an unmemorable face. Probably the son of someone with money, looking for a vanity office for his startup. The young woman was something else. In his prime, Henry had moved in commercial real estate circles where second-tier celebrities occasionally crossed his social calendar. He had taken women to dinners. He had hosted dinners with women in attendance. He had, in his peak years, been on terms of casual familiarity with the kind of professional society women who modeled corporate luxury for a living. The young woman in front of him was, by his immediate appraisal, several categories above any of them. Henry experienced, briefly, a small spike of professional interest that was 9/10 business, and 1/10 not quite business. Then his rational mind kicked in, and the small spike subsided into resignation. The 2 young people standing in front of him were not, he assessed, the kind of clients his building was actually built for. They were perhaps in their early 20s at most. They had probably driven out here on a whim. They were going to ask for a tour, walk around for 20 minutes, find some polite excuse, and disappear back into the city without ever calling him again. He had seen this pattern dozens of times. But even a small fly was meat, as the local expression went. He had not had a tenant inquiry in 18 months. Even the smallest deal was worth pursuing. "What kind of business are you in?" he asked, "and how much space were you looking to lease?" The shift in his tone was, in fairness to him, professional rather than rude. He had moved from greeting mode to negotiation mode, and his question was reasonable. It came out, however, sounding like the question of a man who had decided in the first 90 seconds of meeting his prospective tenants that they were going to waste his time, and was attempting to short-circuit the wasting by getting to the rejection-friendly numbers as quickly as possible. Yvette caught the tone immediately. She gave Ethan a tiny, almost imperceptible head shake. Then she turned back to Henry with the same polite, slightly cool smile she had used a moment earlier. "Before we discuss specifics, Mr. Whitlock, would you mind giving us a tour of the building? We'd like to see the interior structure, the floor layouts, the utility systems, and the existing tenant fit-outs. The building's surface presentation is excellent, but we'd want to evaluate the internal condition before committing to any decisions." Henry's mouth tightened. He recognized this maneuver too. It was the standard polite stall of clients who had decided in the first 5 minutes that they did not want the building, but did not want to refuse to his face. They would walk around for an hour. They would make appreciative noises. They would take a few photos. They would mention something about consulting their partners. And he would never hear from them again. He had given this exact tour, with these exact courtesies, to roughly 20 prospective tenants over the past 4 years. None of them had returned. He drew a breath, exhaled it slowly, and addressed the young woman with the specific dignified tired patience of a man who had learned, the hard way, that his time was no longer worth pretending to politeness. "Young lady. With respect. Are you going to lease space in this building or not?" Yvette did not blink. "If you are, please tell me how much area you need, and what you intend to use it for. I will identify a suitable floor and take you to see it. If you are not, please do not waste your time or mine. The building has been on the market for some time. The owners are not in a position to entertain casual tours from parties who are not serious about transacting." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had spent the better part of 24 hours being insulted by, in chronological order, a drunk corporate antagonist, a roomful of skeptical senior physicists, and a doorman at a restaurant. He had handled all of it with reasonable composure. But there was something specific about the way Henry Whitlock had addressed Yvette, in that tone, on Henry Whitlock's own property, that was triggering Ethan's reservoir of accumulated frustration in a way that was not going to be productive. He drew a breath to respond. Yvette's hand, beside him, moved discreetly. Her index finger pressed gently against his ribcage through the fabric of his blazer, in the universal interpersonal signal of "be quiet, I have this." Ethan, with effort, did not speak. Yvette turned back to Henry Whitlock, and let her own polite smile go very slightly cool at the edges. "I would gently point out that even a customer at a market stall expects to inspect the goods before purchase. You are selling, or in this case leasing, a building. We have driven a considerable distance to evaluate it. I am asking you to show us its interior. You are refusing." She tilted her head slightly. "If there is some reason you do not want us to see the interior of your own building, please be candid about what that reason is. Otherwise, my employer and I, who have demonstrated our seriousness by coming personally to this site, would appreciate the courtesy of being treated as serious prospective tenants, rather than dismissed at the curb by an owner who, forgive me, does not appear to be in a position to be selective about his clientele." The last clause was not, by the standards of normal commercial negotiation, polite. The last clause was, however, accurate. Henry Whitlock, who had spent the last 4 years thoroughly aware of his own market position, and accustomed to nobody mentioning it to his face, felt the observation land with the precise sting of a well-aimed insect. He looked at the young woman with new attention. Then he looked at the young man, who had visibly been about to say something significantly less polite, and had only stopped because the young woman had stopped him. Then he looked at the keys in his pocket. He realized, just been outmaneuvered by a person who was, on her face, approximately half his age. He realized, just been politely told that his attitude toward his own livelihood was contributing to the 4-year vacancy of his only asset. He pulled out the keys. All right. Follow me. The interior of the Larkspur Avenue Tower turned out to be considerably better than its lonely exterior had suggested. The building had been constructed to Class A specifications. The lobby was a high-ceiling space of polished stone and dark wood, designed to project the impression of corporate seriousness without crossing into ostentation. The elevators were modern, fast, and over-engineered for the size of the building. The interior office floors were open-plan, with high ceilings and excellent natural light. The utility systems were new and barely used. The mechanical rooms were spotless. Several of the upper floors had been fitted out for executive use at the building's construction, in anticipation of the high-end tenants that had never come. 2 of the floors had complete corner offices, conference suites, executive bathrooms, and even small kitchenettes. The building was, in short, exactly what an ambitious tech startup would have killed to occupy. It was also, manifestly, an asset that had been built for a market that had never materialized. Walking the floors with Ethan and Yvette behind him, Henry felt the careful, professional silence of 2 clients who were genuinely interested. His clients did not make appreciative noises. They did not take photos for show. They walked the floors with attention. They opened cabinets. They tested light switches. They measured the depth of the floor plates with their eyes. By the time they were riding the elevator back down to the ground floor, even Henry, who had spent years preparing for disappointment, could feel the small, unwilling stir of hope. He suppressed it. He had been disappointed too many times to allow it again. In the lobby, he turned to face them and produced the question that he had asked dozens of times before. What floor did you have in mind? He cleared his throat. Starting a business is not easy. If you're willing to commit to 2 adjacent floors, I can offer you a reasonable rate. Yvette did not answer immediately. Instead, she pulled out her phone. She made a brief call. The call was to a number stored under a single character in her contacts, and the conversation was conducted in clipped, efficient executive shorthand. I need a building appraisal firm on Larkspur Avenue in Ashford City within 90 minutes. Class A office tower, 31 floors, structural inspection, market valuation, environmental survey, the works. I'll send you the address and the specifications. Charge it to my personal account. Thank you. She hung up. She turned back to Henry Whitlock. Henry, who had been preparing his polite rejection deflection for what he had assumed would be the standard end of the tour, looked at her phone with the dawning realization that something significantly different was happening. Yvette gave him a small, polite smile. We have decided that we are not interested in leasing 2 floors. Henry's heart sank. We are, however, interested in purchasing the entire building. Henry's heart, having sunk a moment ago, performed a small, confused upward motion. Including the surrounding undeveloped lots, if those are also under your ownership. Which, if my research is correct, they are. Henry's mouth opened. We will need the appraisal firm to confirm valuation before we make a formal offer. Their inspection should take a few hours. If you are amenable, perhaps you'd like to join us for lunch while we wait. She gestured toward Bumblebee, parked at the curb. My employer is buying. Henry Whitlock, standing in the lobby of his own building, looked at the polished stone floor, looked at the high-ceilinged lobby, looked at the 2 young people who had just casually proposed to purchase an asset on which his entire family fortune had been lost, and felt, for the first time in 4.5 years, a small and entirely unfamiliar emotion. It was, he realized after a moment of confusion, hope. He did not entirely know how to respond to it. Eventually, he managed. Lunch sounds fine. Chapter 116, Chapter 115, Buying the Building, Banking Tiers Unknown 2756 words for advanced chapters /Patreon.com/handsome.god, you're buying the building. Henry Whitlock's voice, on the way to the parking lot, was very quiet. He had asked the question 3 times in the last hour, in slightly different phrasings, and Yvette had answered with patient confirmation each time. "We're buying the building." Mr. Ethan, walking on her other side, did not contribute to the conversation. He had decided, somewhere during the second floor of the tour, that letting Yvette handle the entire transaction was the correct division of labor. She was visibly enjoying herself in a way he had not seen during the dinner the previous evening, and her enjoyment, he suspected, came partly from the fact that her professional skills were finally being deployed in a context that mattered. He let her work. The building inspection firm Yvette had summoned arrived within 90 minutes, exactly as ordered. The firm's reputation in Ashford City commercial real estate was such that their inspections normally required a 4-week advance booking. The fact that they had cleared their schedule to arrive at Larkspur Avenue on 90 minutes' notice was, by itself, a piece of business intelligence that Henry would have been processing if he had not been preoccupied with the larger fact that someone wanted to buy his building. The lead inspector, a competent middle-aged woman named Marian Velt, walked the building with the efficient brisk pace of an experienced professional. Her team of 4 spread across the floors with handheld scanners, measuring devices, and the particular focus calm of people who routinely identified building defects that cost developers millions of marks to remediate. The full inspection of a 31-story office tower typically took 3 to 4 weeks. The Velt team, working in parallel, completed an initial structural and systems assessment in just over 4 hours. When they reconvened in the lobby, Marian gave Yvette her preliminary report with the directness of a senior professional addressing a senior client. The building is in considerably better condition than its exterior position would suggest. Structural integrity is sound. The mechanical systems are within their first life cycle, and have been properly maintained despite the building's vacancy. The electrical infrastructure exceeds Class A specifications. The fire suppression system is current. The elevators are well maintained. The exterior cladding has some weathering but no concerning deterioration. She paused. "There are several minor items I would flag for proper attention, mostly cosmetic, and one moderate item regarding the rooftop HVAC unit that needs servicing within the next 18 months. None of these are deal breakers. None of them affect the building's habitability or its long-term value. What's your professional valuation?" The construction quality and Class A specifications would place the building's replacement cost at approximately 2.5 billion marks. The market value, given the development zone location and the lack of nearby tenant activity, is depressed. I would estimate fair market value at 1.8 to 2.1 billion marks, depending on negotiation. Yvette nodded. Time pressure note. We're prepared to close today. Can your team complete a full structural and environmental survey before we sign final paperwork next week? Marian Velt blinked. The request was unusual. The pressure to complete a comprehensive survey, on a 1-week timeline, was the kind of pressure normally applied only by clients who were doing something significantly more important than a normal real estate transaction. With your timing, my recommendation is that you sign a conditional purchase agreement with the owner today, with the condition that the sale is contingent on no major defects emerging during the comprehensive survey. We can have the full report to you in 7 business days. That way you get your time-pressured closure, my team gets to do its job properly, and you have legal cover if anything significant emerges from the inspection. That works for us. Henry, who had been listening to the conversation with the increasing sense of a man whose life was being briskly reorganized around him by people who knew what they were doing, nodded slowly. That's fine. I don't have any concerns about the inspection. The building is sound. Yvette gave him a small, courteous smile. Excellent. Then if you don't mind, Mr. Whitlock, we'll head to your bank to handle the financial portion of the transaction. My legal team is meeting us there. Henry's bank, by happy coincidence, was the same branch of Valerian National Bank that handled most of Ashford City's commercial real estate transactions. It was a sleek, modern facility in the central business district, with high ceilings and an open-plan layout that signaled corporate-grade banking. Yvette had, while still standing in the lobby of the Larkspur Avenue Tower, made 3 calls. The first had been to a senior partner at one of the Republic's most prestigious law firms. The second had been to the bank itself, alerting them that a significant transaction was incoming. The third had been to her own corporate compliance officer, instructing him to begin preparing the new Future Technology Energy Company paperwork that would receive the building as a corporate asset. By the time Ethan, Yvette, and Henry arrived at the bank, a team of 7 lawyers in matching dark suits were waiting in the executive reception area. Henry's eyes, accustomed for the past 4 years to a banking experience that consisted mostly of receiving overdraft notices, took in the legal team with the dawning understanding of a man who was watching something significant happen. The lawyers' badges identified them as senior counsel from one of the 3 top-tier commercial firms in the Republic. The kind of firm that ordinarily handled M&A transactions for sovereign wealth funds, multi-billion-mark corporate consolidations, and international litigation involving heads of state. Their hourly rates, Henry calculated automatically, were in the range of 15,000 marks per hour per attorney. The team of 7, doing 6 hours of work, would cost approximately 750,000 marks just in legal fees. For a building purchase, Yvette had brought a top-tier legal team for what was, by the standards of her likely portfolio, a routine real estate transaction. The implication that Henry's brain was now processing, slowly, was that the young woman in the cream sweater had access to professional resources of a kind that Henry had encountered, in his entire career, only at a distance. The lead attorney, a polished gentleman in his 50s named Walter Fry, approached Yvette with the deferential bow of a senior professional greeting a major client. "Thank you for the rapid response. Run the standard purchase template, conditional on the 7-day environmental survey contingency we discussed. Negotiate the final price downward as appropriate. Whitlock is the seller." Walter Fry gave Henry a polite, professional nod. "A pleasure. If you'll follow my team to the conference room, we can begin reviewing the documentation." The price negotiation, which under normal conditions could have stretched across days or weeks of formal back and forth, was completed in under an hour. Walter Fry and his team operated with the focused, polite efficiency of professionals whose job was to ensure that the transaction closed quickly and cleanly. They identified line items in Henry's documentation that could be adjusted in his client's favor. They suggested alternative phrasings for several clauses. They proposed reasonable accommodations for both parties. Henry, sitting across the table, had not been in an extended commercial negotiation in years. He found, to his surprise, that he was being treated with significantly more professional courtesy than he had expected. The lawyers were not trying to bully him. They were not trying to trick him. They were simply ensuring that the transaction reflected the appropriate price for the asset and protected both parties from common contingencies. The final agreed price was 1.96 billion marks. Henry, looking at the number on the printed final agreement, felt his hands tremble slightly. The number was lower than his peak hopes for the building 5 years earlier. It was significantly higher than his current expectations after 4 years of vacancy. It was, by any reasonable measure, fair. More importantly, it was a number that would, in cash, allow Henry Whitlock to pay off the construction debts that had been quietly accumulating interest against his name, settle the outstanding alimony obligations to his ex-wife, invest the remaining capital prudently and live, for the rest of his life, in modest but secure comfort. Perhaps even reach out to his son in the Meridian Commonwealth, with the dignity-restoring news that his father had not, in the end, lost everything. Henry signed the agreement with a hand that did not entirely steady itself until the second signature. The final administrative step was the payment. The bank's branch president, a sleek-haired professional named Sebastian Marsh, had personally come down to the conference room to oversee the transaction. A transfer of this size, executed at his branch, would significantly affect his quarterly performance metrics. He was, for the duration of the proceedings, personally attentive in the manner of a senior banker who understood that obsequiousness was the appropriate posture. He brought a card reader to the conference table and presented it to Ethan with both hands. "If you would please enter your account number and authorization." Ethan, who had been quiet for most of the negotiation, accepted the reader. He entered the account number and the security credentials with the unconcerned efficiency of someone who had been performing this exact action since he was 12. He pressed the confirmation key. The reader emitted a soft, polite tone. Then, in clean white letters on the display screen, the reader produced a message that nobody at the table had ever seen before. Account authorization level insufficient for transaction. Please initiate elevated tier verification. Sebastian Marsh blinked. He looked at the screen. He looked at the screen again. He pulled out his own banking tablet, opened the transaction record, and confirmed that the message was, in fact, displaying as the system had intended. I beg your pardon. Walter Fry, who had been watching the exchange, frowned. I have practiced commercial law for 15 years, and have personally supervised 7 9-figure transactions, and 1 10-figure transaction. I have never seen that message. The other senior partner of the legal team, a meticulous woman named Diana Klein who specialized in financial law, leaned forward. That is not a standard Valerian National Bank transfer machine response. I have never seen that screen. Around the table, the legal team and the bank's officers looked at each other with the specific shared confusion of professionals encountering a feature they had not previously known existed. Yvette, sitting beside Ethan, allowed herself a small, careful expression. She had been, in her own decade of high-stakes commercial work, what she would have described as a top-tier banking customer. Her portfolio had, at its peak, included over 4 billion marks in liquid and semi-liquid assets, distributed across the standard high-end client categories that the major Valerian banks offered. The standard client tier hierarchy ran, then, above Onyx, a category whose existence Yvette had heard discussed only in unconfirmed whispers among the most senior figures in her industry. Private banking. The private banking tier was offered, by invitation only, to clients whose total relationship with the bank exceeded 10 billion marks across all instruments. The list of private banking clients at Valerian National Bank was, by industry rumor, fewer than 200 individuals globally. Yvette had, in her career, met 3 private banking clients. None of them had been under 50. The card reader in front of Ethan was, evidently, telling them that private banking was insufficient authorization for the requested transaction. Which meant there was a tier above private banking. Which meant there was a tier of banking clients whose existence even Yvette, with her decade of experience at the high end of the industry, had not previously been aware of. She did not say anything. She did, however, lift one eyebrow approximately 2 millimeters. Sebastian Marsh, the branch president, was no longer looking at the card reader. He was looking at Ethan. He was looking at Ethan with the specific careful, increasingly trembling attention of a man who had just realized that his afternoon was about to become significantly more important than he had projected when he arrived at the office that morning. The card reader had requested elevated tier verification. The elevated tier was a banking category that Sebastian, as the branch president of one of the larger commercial banks in Ashford City, had heard mentioned in passing during a senior management training course exactly once, 2 years ago. The instructor had described it as a confidential tier reserved for clients whose individual influence on national or international finance was significant enough to warrant a dedicated handling protocol. The training course had not provided specifics. Sebastian had assumed, at the time, that the tier was a theoretical construct used for training purposes. He had never met anyone who actually held this status. The teenager sitting across the conference table from him, 10 zeros showing on the requested transaction, was apparently a member of that tier. Sebastian's hand, holding a teacup that had been provided by his junior assistant, began to tremble noticeably. The teacup slipped. The porcelain shattered against the polished conference table with a sharp, brittle crack. Everyone in the room jumped. Sebastian, ignoring the broken porcelain and the spreading tea, took a small, careful step backward from the table. He executed a slow, deliberate bow toward Ethan. The bow was deeper than the courtesies he had offered earlier in the meeting. It was the bow that a senior banker offered to a client whose social and financial weight required deference rather than transactional politeness. "Esteemed sir." His voice was quiet. Sebastian Marsh, branch president of Valerian National Bank, Ashford City Central. It is my honor to be in your presence. The room went very still. Yvette, who had been considering whether to make a quiet observation, decided against it. Walter Fry, the lead attorney, had paused mid-document review, and was now watching the exchange with the careful, evaluating attention of a senior professional who had just realized that the case was substantially more interesting than he had previously appraised. Henry Whitlock, who had spent the last hour being treated with professional courtesy by people who had taken his transaction seriously, now found himself watching the same people transition into deferential awe in the presence of his buyer. The shift was so pronounced that Henry, sitting in his own bank, suddenly felt as though he was an extra in a film about someone else. Sebastian Marsh straightened from his bow. If you would honor us with a few additional minutes, sir, the verification of your account permissions requires a more private setting than this conference room can offer. May I escort you to one of our executive suites? Ethan, who had been told by Graves, weeks ago, that his account permissions had been upgraded, was experiencing a slow, irritated realization that the upgrade had been considerably more comprehensive than he had assumed. Graves had not specified what the upgrade actually entailed. Graves, Ethan reflected, had a habit of dropping consequential administrative bombshells with the casual offhandedness of a man who assumed that the recipient would figure out the implications on their own. Ethan suppressed a sigh. He nodded once at Sebastian Marsh. Lead the way, Mr. He turned to Yvette, gave her a small, slightly apologetic glance, and gestured at the conference room. Hold the room. I think this is going to take a moment. Yvette nodded. Take your time, Mercer. I'll have the agreement ready for execution when you return. Ethan stood up. Sebastian Marsh, with the careful courtesy of a man escorting royalty, led him out of the conference room, and toward the bank's private executive corridor. The conference room, in their absence, held its collective breath. Walter Fry was the first to speak. He turned to Yvette and asked, in the careful tone of an attorney who had just identified a critical piece of missing context about his own client, forgive me. Who precisely is your employer? Yvette took a small, careful sip of her water. She set the glass down. She gave Walter Fry a polite smile. I think you may want to sit down before I answer that. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Novels Wonderland.